Let us travel together to the medieval Alps in the winter of 1077. In January 1077, Henry IV reached the snow-bound Apennines and stopped beneath Canossa Castle, where Pope Gregory VII was staying with Matilda of Tuscany. The German king had crossed the Alps during winter to seek release from excommunication before his enemies could choose another ruler. Goslar, in the winter of 1056, finds you standing beneath a pale sky while the royal assembly gathers around the 6-year-old Henry. Winter smoke rises above Goslar in thin blue threads, drifting from kitchens and stable fires across the roofs of the royal estate. Around you, horses stamp upon frozen ground, their breath whitening the air beside leather harness and wooden carts. Woolen cloaks crowd the entrance to the hall, dark with frost at the shoulders and heavy with the smells of rain, smoke, and lanolin. Somewhere beyond the walls, a monastery bell sounds through the morning mist. Its note travels slowly over the fields, passes above the roads, and fades among the bare branches. Your boots rest upon hard earth, while servants carry bundles of parchment from one doorway to another. The cold touches your hands. Warm wax waits beside a brazier, ready to receive the royal seal. Henry was born on 11 November 1050, probably at Goslar, the eldest son of Emperor Henry III and Empress Agnes of Poitou. 4 years later, in 1053, the child was elected German king, though he was still too young to fully understand the significance of the oath. The election placed a crown in the distance before he could reach it. After the death of Henry III in 1056, the crown passed to his successor. At 6 years old, Henry is the last medieval German king to inherit the throne as a minor. Men twice his age bend towards him, speak over him, and measure the strength of the kingdom through the small hands resting upon the arms of his chair. You can see that the adults already understand the throne is vulnerable. The hall is warm, though the warmth remains close to the walls, gathered around iron braziers and the shoulders of men pressed together beneath woolen cloaks. Smoke curls beneath the rafters and mingles with the scents of beeswax, damp leather, and rushes strewn across the floor. You hear the low movement of many voices, softened by timber and stone. A quill rasps beneath a clerk's hand. Metal rings against a wooden cup. Near the dais, a seal is pressed into warm red wax, which gives softly under the weight. Beyond the open doors, hoofbeats strike the frozen road, slow and hollow, as another rider arrives. The sound enters the hall, pauses in the minds of those gathered, and disappears into the winter morning. Empress Agnes of Poitou now governs as regent during her son's minority, bearing the burden of a monarchy whose authority is attached to his person. Her position is solemn, but it is not secure. The German kingdom has no permanent capital where the machinery of rule can remain in one place. Instead, the king moves between royal estates, courts, and military centers, and the court moves with him. Every journey requires carts, horses, provisions, scribes, guards, servants, and men able to interpret the king's will. Around Agnes, powerful princes begin to enlarge their influence. They accept offices, gather dependents, strengthen castles, and turn temporary responsibility into lasting authority. The child remains king, while other hands become accustomed to ruling in his name. Across the courtyard, the traveling court takes shape beneath the winter light. Carts stand in a rough line, their wheels packed with frozen mud and their canvas covers stiff from the cold. Horses lower their heads into steaming troughs. Clerks protect bundles of parchment beneath their cloaks, while servants count sacks of grain and inspect the iron rims of the wagon wheels. A small chest holds seals, coins, and the instruments of administration. You pass close enough to smell horsehair, ash, and the sharp oil rubbed into harness. The royal household is not a palace resting upon a hill. It is a moving arrangement of bodies and objects, bound together by roads. Hoofbeats on frozen ground carry the kingdom onward. The authority of a medieval king depends upon personal presence. It rests upon oaths sworn before him, revenues collected in his name, castles held by loyal men, and alliances renewed through gifts, marriages, judgments, and military assistance. When the king appears, obedience becomes visible. When he is absent, another person may speak with his voice. During Agnes's regency, this absence is built into the nature of the monarchy. Henry is present as a symbol, yet other men negotiate, command, and decide. The princes learn that royal authority can be approached through custody of the king, control of the court, and influence over the regent. The throne remains intact, but the power surrounding it begins to change hands. At Goslar, winter presses against the walls, and light enters the hall in narrow strips between wooden shutters. You feel the coarse weave of the cloak around your shoulders, roughened by travel and smoke. A servant places a cup of warmed wine near the brazier, and its sweetness rises briefly through the colder smells of the room. Beneath your feet, rushes conceal fragments of straw, splintered wood, and dried mud. The royal banner hangs without movement in the still air. Its fabric is heavy. Its colors are muted by the dimness. The fire shifts. A horse coughs outside. From the monastery, bells sound again before dawn, slower now, as though the morning itself is reluctant to begin. In 1062, the balance of power within the regency shifted at Kaiserswerth. Archbishop Anno II of Cologne seizes custody of the young king. The act is remembered as the Kaiserswerth coup, though its violence is contained within a swift transfer of movement and guardianship. Henry is taken from Agnes's protection and brought under Anno's control. The precise gestures of the seizure matter less than the result. Agnes's position is weakened, and practical control of the monarchy passes towards competing churchmen and princes. Whoever holds the child king can shape the royal household, influence decisions, reward supporters, and determine which voices reach the throne. Kaiserswerth lies beside the broad Rhine, where the river carries grey winter light beneath a colourless sky. Around you, the water moves heavily between dark banks, breaking against reeds glazed with ice. Boats knock softly against their moorings, and ropes creak whenever the current draws them outward. Men in thick cloaks move along the landing place, their boots leaving dark marks upon the frozen mud. A bell sounds from the church, muffled by river mist. The air smells of wet timber, cold water, and smoke from distant hearths. You hear horses stirring on the bank, followed by the brief clatter of harness. Then the river resumes its quiet rhythm, carrying the sound away. The young Henry is carried into a political world where custody becomes authority. Archbishop Anno II is not merely a guardian in the household sense. As Archbishop of Cologne, he belongs to a class of imperial bishops who hold spiritual offices alongside substantial lands, revenues, and political responsibilities. Such men can administer territories, collect income, maintain fortified places, gather armed followers, and advise the king. Their religious position gives them prestige, while their worldly resources give them power. The seizure at Kaiserswerth, therefore, places Henry within a contest among men who understand both the sacred character of kingship and the practical methods by which a realm can be governed. The riverbank grows quiet as evening gathers over Kaiserswerth. A thin skin of ice forms in hollows beside the road, and the last light rests upon it like dull silver. You stand near a timber gate while a groom rubs down a tired horse, drawing a cloth along its steaming flank. The animal's breath rises and vanishes. Somewhere in the settlement, a pot lid closes, and a child's voice fades behind a wall. The smell of boiled grain drifts through the cold. Under an awning, a clerk warms his fingers above a charcoal pan before returning to his parchment. Wax seals cool in a small wooden box. The red wax has hardened, holding the impression of authority in silence. During the later 1060s, Henry reaches legal and political maturity. He begins to understand that the men who governed during his childhood have not merely protected the kingdom. They have also acquired habits of command. Agnes's regency allowed powerful princes to enlarge their influence, while Anno's seizure showed that custody of the king could redirect the monarchy itself. Henry's education is therefore an education in recovery. He must learn the names of territories, the temper of nobles, the revenues of estates, and the loyalties attached to castles and bishoprics. Beneath these practical concerns lies a conviction that will guide him. His conception of kingship rests strongly upon the belief that royal authority comes from God. Night settles over the road beyond the river, and the travelling household prepares for sleep. Lanterns swing from poles, making small pools of amber light upon cart wheels and frozen ruts. The canvas covers breathe slightly in the wind. Leather straps stiffen. Woolen cloaks hang from pegs near the fire, giving off the faint scent of damp fibres. You hear the quiet scrape of a knife dividing bread, the murmur of a prayer, and the soft stamping of animals in the dark. A clerk folds parchment beneath a weighted board. A seal presses into warm red wax once more, leaving a raised edge that catches the lantern light. Above the roofs, smoke gathers beneath the stars. For Henry, divine authority is not an ornament added to political power. It is the foundation from which political power derives its meaning. The king is anointed, crowned, and placed within a sacred order that cannot be reduced to the consent of individual princes. Yet the daily exercise of kingship depends upon roads, revenues, armed men, and written commands. Henry must therefore connect the unseen source of authority with the visible instruments of rule. He must make his presence felt at royal estates, courts, and military centres. He must receive oaths personally, confirm privileges, judge disputes, and reward those who serve him. The young king's belief in God-given authority grows alongside his practical need to regain control of the kingdom. At dawn, you travel with the court along a frozen road, where the wheels of the carts leave dark grooves beneath a veil of white frost. Hoofbeats strike a measured rhythm, first from the leading riders and then from the long procession behind them. The air is clean and severe. Bare trees stand close to the roadside, each branch edged with silver. A raven crosses the pale sky and settles beyond a field wall. In the distance, smoke rises from a village, bending low beneath the wind. The court carries its own weather with it, a mixture of breath, leather, canvas, and wood smoke. Bells from a monastery sound in the distance, and the procession moves through their fading notes. The absence of a permanent capital makes every journey politically important. A king who travels can gather revenues where they are produced, inspect castles where they are needed, and meet nobles upon their own ground. He can also remind distant territories that royal authority remains embodied in a living ruler. The court's movement links scattered estates into a temporary centre. At one place, Henry receives petitions. At another, he confirms an oath. Elsewhere, he gathers troops or presides over a council. The kingdom is not held together by one city, one palace, or one fixed office. It is held together through repeated encounters between the king and those who claim to serve him. At a roadside estate, morning light falls upon rough timber, pale snow, and the dark backs of tethered horses. You pass a kitchen where steam escapes beneath the door, carrying the smells of onions, broth, and wet ash. A boy gathers broken branches into a basket. Two dogs sleep near the wall, their ears lifting whenever wheels pass over frozen ground. Inside the hall, a fire burns low beneath a blackened beam. Parchment lies beside a horning quell, and the quill has left tiny dark marks across the scribe's fingers. The walls are plain. The benches are hard. Yet every object belongs to the machinery of kingship moving through winter. The importance of bishops becomes clearer each time the court stops. An imperial bishop may hold a spiritual office, but he also governs lands, receives revenues, supervises dependents, and carries political responsibilities on behalf of the monarchy. A bishopric can provide food, money, fortified buildings, horses, and armed support. It can also connect the king to roads, river crossings, markets, and local communities. The appointment of a bishop therefore affects the military and administrative strength of the monarchy. A man chosen for a vacant see may become a loyal pillar of royal authority or a powerful figure whose interests gradually separate from the king's. The question of appointment reaches far beyond the church door. Rain begins lightly during the afternoon, though the cold turns each drop almost weightless upon your cloak. The road darkens beneath the wheels. Mud gathers along the cart rims, and the horses pull with lowered heads. A monastery appears beyond a stand of leafless trees, its walls pale against the clouds. From within, bells mark the hours, their voices travelling across the wet fields. You hear parchment rasp beneath a quill as a clerk records provisions, names, and payments. Lamps are being lit in the guest hall. Their flames tremble whenever the door opens. The smells of wool, wax, and damp stone settle around you, gentle and close. The struggle over church appointments develops within a wider reform movement. Reformers oppose simony, the buying and selling of ecclesiastical office, and resist clerical marriage as a sign of insufficient discipline. They also condemn excessive lay control over ecclesiastical appointments. Their concern is not merely with private conduct. They seek a church whose offices are governed by spiritual principles rather than by the wealth, marriages, and political arrangements of secular rulers. Cluny becomes an important centre of monastic reform, carrying disciplined religious practice across its network of houses. Later, Hersfeld becomes another important centre, bringing reforming energy into the German lands. The language of renewal grows steadily stronger. Within the monastery, the air is warmer than outside, though the stone retains a deep, damp chill. You walk along a passage where candlelight rests upon uneven walls and worn thresholds. The scent of beeswax mingles with ink, wool, and old timber. A monk crosses silently with a covered bowl, his sandals making almost no sound. Through an open doorway, you see a scribe bent over parchment, the point of his quill moving in small, deliberate strokes. Beyond the cloister, rain touches the roof tiles. The sound falls evenly, like fingers passing over cloth. Before dawn, the monastery bells will ring again, and the whole building will seem to breathe with them. For Henry, the reform movement presents both a challenge and an opportunity. If lay rulers cannot appoint bishops freely, then the king's influence over the political structure of the kingdom will be reduced. Yet if bishops remain entirely dependent upon secular favour, spiritual reformers will regard the monarchy as an obstacle to renewal. The future struggle will concern the appointment of bishops, but also the wider boundary between spiritual and secular authority. Who grants an office? Who gives it symbols? Who commands the lands attached to it? Who may judge a ruler who interferes with the church? These questions gather around the young king as closely as winter smoke above Goslar. The royal hall at evening is crowded again, but the voices are softer than before. You sit near the wall, where warmth from the fire reaches your hands without touching your back. Woolen cloaks overlap along the benches, their folds holding the odours of frost and travel. A clerk bends over parchment, and each movement of the quill makes a dry, delicate rasp. Near the doorway, a groom shakes snow from a saddle blanket. The banner hangs above the dais, its edge moving whenever wind slips beneath the door. Outside, horses shift in their stalls. Somewhere beyond the court, a bell gives one measured note. It remains in the air for a moment, then fades into the dark. Henry's early years have shown him the cost of allowing others to exercise authority in his name. The regency has given princes new room to act. The Kaiserswerth coup has transferred practical control of the monarchy to competing churchmen and nobles. The travelling court has taught him that power must be carried, witnessed, sealed, and renewed. The bishoprics have shown him that spiritual office can command lands and armies. Cluny and Hersfeld have revealed that religious reform can become a political force. As Henry reaches maturity during the later 1060s, he begins to gather companions who share his interests and assert his will against those who once instructed him. The boy crowned at 6 is becoming a king determined to rule. In the stable yard, night has softened every hard edge. Snow rests upon the cart roofs. Steam rises from the horses and drifts beneath the lanterns. You hear a groom brushing a mane, the slow stroke followed by a quiet breath. Leather creaks as harness is hung upon wooden pegs. A dog turns once upon the straw and becomes still. The fires have burned lower, leaving only a red glow behind the iron grates. Far away, a monastery bell sounds before dawn, though darkness has not yet lifted. Its note passes over the roofs and frozen roads. It is a small sound. It fills the wide silence. The kingdom Henry inherits is therefore a realm of movement and personal relationships. Its boundaries are real, but its government is not concentrated in a single administrative centre. Authority travels with the king, his seals, his clerks, his household, and the people who depend upon his favour. Revenues must be collected from estates. Castles must be maintained. Oaths must be remembered. Alliances must be renewed before they weaken. A royal command written on parchment may travel farther than the king, yet its force depends upon men who believe Henry can reward obedience and punish resistance. The crown is sacred, but the kingdom is practical. Both aspects now meet within the mind of the young ruler. You are standing once more near the road outside Goslar. Winter smoke rises above the roofs. The ground is hard beneath your feet. A cart waits in the grey light, its wheels dark with mud. The horses are quiet. Henry's name is spoken near the fire. It is written upon parchment. It is pressed into wax. His authority has been borrowed by other men, but it has not vanished. The road lies open. The bells begin. The king moves onward. You are standing among the wooded hills of Saxony, where winter roads pass beneath dark firs and bare oak branches. Around you, newly raised fortifications occupy ridges that once belonged only to hunting paths, village boundaries, and the customary authority of local lords. Pine resin clings to the air near the timber walls, mingling with the damp scent of earth pressed flat by many travelling boots. Iron tools strike the wooden palisades in measured blows, while carpenters fit beams into place beneath a grey sky. Smoke from campfires drifts between the trees, thin and blue against the rain. Men carry baskets of soil towards the banks, and horses stand patiently beside wagons loaded with sharpened stakes. The low murmur of monks chanting rises from a small chapel beyond the works, where candlelight trembles upon stone. After assuming more direct control, Henry IV tried to strengthen royal authority against the great princes whose power had grown during his minority. The young king relied partly upon ministeriales, a developing service elite whose members depended upon the king and could therefore serve him beyond the older limits of noble custom. These men administered estates, carried messages, supervised labor, and stood near the practical machinery of royal government. Their position gave Henry useful support, yet it also deepened suspicion among the Saxon nobles. During the early 1070s, Henry built or expanded royal fortifications across Saxony, placing visible signs of his authority upon the hills. To the king, a castle offered security, order, and a firm resting place for royal officials. To the Saxon nobles, the same stone or timber enclosure could appear as an occupation post, watching over a country that considered itself ancient, proud, and accustomed to influence. Rain gathers upon the palisade and falls in narrow lines between the upright timbers. Beneath the wall, mud receives each drop without sound, while boot heels leave deep impressions along the unfinished ditch. A hammer pauses, then resumes its patient rhythm. The smell of wet bark rises from freshly cut beams, and pine resin glistens where an axe has opened the wood. Beyond the rampart, The hills disappear into mist, their slopes softened, until the forest seems to have no clear edge. A small fire burns beneath a rough shelter, giving little warmth but much smoke. Men bend over iron fittings, their hands blackened by soot and rain. Somewhere among the trees, a bell sounds once, and the monks continue their low chant, each note settling into the damp air like a stone placed carefully upon another. Petitions began to travel towards the royal court, carrying complaints about castles, officials, labor demands, and the narrowing of customary influence. The Saxon nobles did not see themselves as enemies of kingship, but they resisted a form of kingship that seemed to advance through unfamiliar servants and permanent strongholds. Their objections reached Henry through meetings and written appeals, yet each side interpreted the other's language according to a different understanding of order. The king believed that royal peace required authority capable of reaching every region. The nobles believed that peace depended upon inherited agreements, local liberties, and the personal recognition of their rank. Every new official could therefore seem like an intrusion, while every noble refusal could appear to Henry as deliberate defiance. Around the fortifications, quiet distrust hardened into political danger, and the wooded hills became a landscape of watchfulness. At Hersfeld, the royal presence stood above the surrounding country, its walls rising from the hills amid wet grass and dark forest. The approach was steep, and carts had carved 2 deep channels through the soil, their edges filled with rainwater. The scent of pine resin followed the road upward, mixed with the sharp odor of horses and the earthy sweetness of leaves beginning to decay. Wooden platforms creaked beneath the weight of stored grain. Guards watched through gaps in the palisade, while smoke from campfires moved low beneath the grey sky. Rain tapped upon shields hung beneath an awning, and iron tools rested beside heaps of timber. Far below, the valleys lay muted beneath cloud. The castle could seem reassuring from within its walls, yet threatening from the fields below, where its towers marked the arrival of royal power. A major Saxon revolt began in 1073, when resistance gathered openly around grievances that petitions had failed to resolve. The rebels attacked or threatened several royal castles, including Hersfeld, and danger spread quickly through the countryside. Henry faced severe pressure, with his military position weakened and his support uncertain across the wider German kingdom. He temporarily withdrew from Saxony, leaving behind the impression that royal strength had been driven from the region. The retreat did not settle the argument, for the rebels now possessed confidence, while the king carried the memory of humiliation. In 1074, negotiations produced a settlement requiring the destruction of some contested fortifications. The agreement offered a pause, but it rested upon mistrust, and the castles had already become symbols rather than mere buildings. When the settlement broke down, conflict returned with greater force. The road descending from Hersfeld is heavy with mud beneath traveling boots. Wheels turn slowly through the ruts, drawing up dark water that shines briefly before sinking into the ground. Rain moves across the open slopes in slanting veils, and the forest absorbs the faint sounds of men gathering beyond the ridge. A torn banner hangs from a pole near the gate, its cloth darkened by moisture. Under the shelter of an overhanging roof, 2 horses breathe clouds into the cold air. Someone has left an iron buckle beside the fire, where its surface warms and cools with the embers. Pine smoke settles among the wet branches, and the scent of damp earth remains strong beneath every other smell. From the distant chapel, chanting continues at an even pace, composed and patient amid the uncertainty beyond the walls. The collapse of the settlement revealed how little trust had survived the negotiations. Some fortifications were destroyed, yet their destruction did not erase the fear that had produced them. The Saxon nobles still regarded royal officials and ministeriales as threats to their customary influence. while Henry regarded their resistance as proof that stronger institutions were necessary. Neither side could return comfortably to the earlier arrangement. The king had learned that authority without dependable military support could retreat quickly. The nobles had learned that pressure could force concessions, but also that concessions might be temporary. Across Saxony, messages passed between castles, estates, monasteries, and courts. The dispute moved beyond individual grievances and began to concern the shape of royal rule itself. Every repaired gate and neglected wall carried political meaning, as if timber and stone had become sentences written upon the landscape. Near a half-built tower, you hear iron striking timber, though the workers have slowed beneath the persistent rain. The beams are pale where they have been cut, and their fresh surfaces hold the clean scent of sap. Water gathers along the lower edge of the palisade before dropping into the ditch. A blanket has been spread beside a small campfire, its wool dark with dampness and its corners weighted by stones. Mud clings to the soles of traveling boots, making each step deliberate. The sky remains a single broad sheet of grey without a visible sun. Along the inner path, a monk walks quietly with a covered lamp, while the low murmur of chanting continues from the chapel. The flame behind the lamp's horn window gives a soft amber glow, scarcely brighter than the embers beneath the cooking pot. The renewed conflict brought Henry back towards Saxony with a more determined purpose. The king gathered forces, negotiated where useful, and prepared to recover the military position lost during his withdrawal. The Saxon and Thuringian rebels could still draw upon powerful local support, yet their coalition remained subject to the rival interests, shaping the wider dispute. Each lord considered the demands of honor, territory, family, and custom, while Henry sought the concentrated obedience required for a royal campaign. The movement of armies transformed familiar roads into lines of supply and retreat. Villages watched men pass beneath banners, and monasteries received messengers carrying requests for food, horses, or prayer. By the spring of 1075, the argument between crown and nobility had become an armed contest whose outcome would decide whether the king could impose his presence upon central Germany. Morning at Langensalza comes beneath a pale and unsettled sky. You stand near open ground where damp grass bends beneath the movement of men and horses. Smoke from campfires hangs close to the earth, carrying the bitter scent of green wood and ash. Leather straps creak as harnesses are tightened, and iron rings knock softly against shield rims. The night's rain has left the ground dark and yielding, with narrow streams running through the wheel tracks. Across the plain, banners stir without revealing the strength of the forces beneath them. Birds lift from the hedges when riders pass, then settle again among the wet branches. The air holds the faint smell of trampled plants, horse sweat, and cold metal. Far away, a bell marks the hour while voices remain low before the battle begins. On 9 June 1075, Henry defeated the Saxon and Thuringian rebels at the Battle of Langensalza. The victory restored Henry's immediate military position in Germany and changed the balance that had favored the rebels after his retreat. The result did not dissolve every grievance or make the political questions disappear, but it demonstrated that the king could return with an army capable of overcoming organized resistance. Saxon leaders were forced to reconsider the risks of continued opposition, while Henry gained room to act from a position of renewed strength. The castles that had begun the dispute now stood within a wider story of jurisdiction, loyalty, and royal command. Langensalza became a memory carried through German courts, spoken beside fires, and recorded by clerks. In the history of Henry IV, 1075 marked both a victory and the clearing of one road before another conflict appeared. After the fighting, the plain grows quiet in uneven stages. Horses shift their weight beside the wagons, and wet leather gives off a heavy animal smell beneath the cooler fragrance of rain. Broken shafts lie among the grass, their pale wood darkened at the ends. Mud covers the lower edges of boots and the wheels of carts, while smoke from campfires drifts beneath the grey sky. Men speak in subdued voices, naming Langensalza, Saxony, and the king. A chapel tent has been opened near the road, and the low murmur of monks chanting moves outward through the damp air. Candlelight touches the folds of a cloth laid over a simple table. The ground remains soft underfoot, and the wind carries the scent of crushed leaves from the hedges. Beyond the field, the wooded hills retain their silence, as though the battle had passed beneath them like a brief storm. The Saxon war coincided with the rise of a more assertive reform papacy. In Rome, Hildebrand became Pope Gregory VII in 1073, after having been involved in Roman reform politics for decades. His authority did not emerge from a sudden invention, for he belonged to a broader movement within the Latin Church that had already questioned the conduct of bishops, abbots, kings, and lesser officials. Gregory's program stressed the freedom of the Church from domination by secular rulers. Reformers sought a clergy less dependent upon wealth, family interest, and royal appointment, believing that ecclesiastical offices required spiritual discipline rather than political purchase. Their ideas traveled through monasteries, councils, letters, and the speech of determined churchmen. While Henry consolidated his position after Langensalza, Rome was developing a language in which royal habits could be examined as matters of Christian order. At a monastery lying beyond the Saxon roads, you enter a narrow cloister where rainwater falls from the roof in a steady line. The stones beneath your feet are cold, and their uneven surfaces hold small pools reflecting the dim daylight. The air smells of wet wool, old parchment, and smoke drawn through the rafters from a distant kitchen. Inside the chapel, lamps burn before painted figures, their flames bending whenever the door opens. The low murmur of monks chanting passes beneath the arches with a calm gravity. A scribe sits near the wall, scraping a page smooth before beginning another line. His ink has a faint metallic scent, and the quill makes a soft sound against the parchment. Outside, pine branches move in the wind, while inside, the hours are measured by bells and the patient repetition of prayer. Gregorian reformers opposed simony, the buying or selling of ecclesiastical office, because they believed spiritual authority could not properly be treated as a possession exchanged for money or patronage. They also opposed clerical marriage, often described by reformers as Nicolaitanism, arguing that priests should embody a distinct discipline and remain free from the competing obligations of household inheritance. These campaigns reached into villages, bishoprics, monasteries, and royal courts, where offices had long been connected with land, service, and political loyalty. The reformers' criticism therefore touched practical arrangements that had endured for generations. A bishop was not merely a spiritual teacher, for he could also hold estates, advise the king, administer justice, and command resources. When reformers demanded a purer clerical order, they were also challenging the networks through which power moved. Gregory's Rome increasingly judged those networks according to principles that did not begin with royal custom. Within the monastery, damp cloaks hang from wooden pegs beside the entrance. Drops gather at their hems and darken the flagstones. A brazier gives off modest warmth, carrying the scent of charcoal and ash into the corridor. Beyond the cloister, rain touches the tiled roof with 1,000 small sounds, while the forest releases the sharper fragrance of pine resin. The pages of a great book turn slowly beneath careful fingers. Beeswax softens near a candle, and a monk's sleeve brushes the table with a faint rustle. From the chapel comes the low murmur of chanting, neither loud nor urgent, yet strong enough to fill the stone passage. The world of castles and armies remains beyond the walls, but here the language of reform is copied into letters, preserved in ink, and prepared for journeys across Europe. Lay investiture meant the appointment or installation of bishops and abbots by secular rulers. In practice, the ceremony could involve the presentation of symbols, the recognition of an office, and the transfer of authority over lands connected with the bishopric or monastery. Kings had long considered such appointments part of their responsibility, especially when bishops served as administrators, counselors, judges, and holders of substantial property. Gregory's reform legislation of 1075 condemned lay investiture, placing established royal practice beneath a direct challenge from the papacy. The decree did not simply object to a gesture performed at an altar. It questioned whether a king possessed the right to confer ecclesiastical office at all. Henry defended inherited practice because kingship, in his understanding, included responsibility for the order of the realm. Gregory defended ecclesiastical liberty because the church, in his understanding, could not remain dependent upon secular will. A cold wind moves through the monastery garden, bending the long grass beside the wall. Rain beads upon the leaves of herbs planted in narrow beds, and the soil releases a dark mineral scent whenever drops strike it. The chapel door remains slightly open, allowing candlelight to fall across the threshold. Inside, chanting continues with a measured rise and fall, while outside, water runs along the channels between the stones. Smoke from a campfire near the stable drifts over the wall, touched with the smell of damp wood and wool. A wooden cart waits beneath an awning, its wheels marked by the mud of distant roads. Near the gate, a messenger warms his hands above a small flame and watches the monks pass quietly through the cloister. Rome seems far away, yet its decisions have begun to travel. The conflict was not initially only about a single ceremony. It involved competing understandings of Christian order, kingship, and jurisdiction, with each side claiming that the health of the realm depended upon its own interpretation. Henry saw royal authority as inherited, practical, and necessary for maintaining peace among powerful territories. Gregory saw the freedom of the church as a condition for correcting corruption and directing Christian society towards a higher discipline. Their disagreement gathered force because bishops occupied both spiritual and political positions. A king who selected a bishop could expect loyalty in government, while a pope who rejected that selection could insist that ecclesiastical office belonged to another order of authority. The issues of simony, Nicolaitism, and lay investiture therefore formed a connected reform program. Saxony had shown Henry the dangers of divided obedience, and Rome was preparing to ask where obedience properly ended. The road from the monastery descends through wet woodland, where branches brush against cloaks and scatter cold drops upon the ground. Mud rises around the edges of traveling boots, and the cart wheels leave deep parallel grooves behind them. Pine resin scents the air where bark has been torn by passing loads, while damp earth fills the hollows beneath the roots. A fire burns in a clearing, its smoke held low beneath the clouds. Men sit near it without speaking, their faces briefly lit by orange coals. From the monastery above, the bells fade into the forest, and the chanting becomes no more than a thread of sound. Rain touches leaves, leather, and timber with separate tones. The whole landscape seems to wait, not for a sudden announcement, but for the slow arrival of consequences already set in motion. Henry's victory at Langensalza gave him greater confidence when dealing with the papacy, yet it also placed his rule within a more demanding European conversation. The king had restored his military position in Germany, but military success could not settle the question of ecclesiastical appointment. His ministers and advisers understood that Gregory's reform was directed against customs upon which royal government depended. Bishops and abbots were not distant figures, separated from administration by a clean boundary. They were woven into the structure of landholding, taxation, law, council, and public ceremony. To abandon control over their appointment might weaken the king's ability to govern. To defend that control might expose Henry to charges of resisting the reform of the church. The memory of Saxony remained close, with its castles, petitions, and sudden revolt. Within this atmosphere, every letter from Rome carried the weight of a political summons. At a royal lodging near the road, you stand beside a fire whose smoke gathers beneath the roof before escaping through a narrow opening. The air smells of wet ash, horse blankets, and pine wood beginning to burn. Outside, rain darkens the timber palisade and runs along the sharpened tops of the stakes. Iron tools rest against a post, their handles rough beneath gloved hands. A clerk bends over parchment while a lamp trembles beside his elbow. The wax seal waits in a small dish, warm enough to receive the king's mark. Travelling boots scrape mud from the threshold, leaving dark flakes upon the packed earth. Beyond the enclosure, the hills vanish into evening mist, and the low murmur of monks chanting rises from a chapel where prayers continue despite the movement of soldiers and messengers. The Reform papacy possessed its own history of struggle, discipline, and institutional ambition. Hildebrand had worked within Roman reform politics for decades, before becoming Pope Gregory VII in 1073, learning how councils, letters, alliances, and moral arguments could reshape authority. His program did not rest upon personal irritation with Henry, although their personalities and circumstances would influence the contest. Gregory believed that the church required freedom from domination by secular rulers, and he treated that freedom as a matter of divine, law rather than administrative preference. Reformers had criticized simony and clerical marriage across many years, connecting both practices with the independence and purity of the clergy. The condemnation of lay investiture in 1075 extended those concerns into the relationship between altar and throne. By then, the dispute had acquired a language capable of reaching kings, bishops, monasteries, and ordinary congregations. Winter darkness gathers beyond the walls, leaving the fortification outlined by small lamps and the red mouths of campfires. Rain continues upon the wooden roofs, though the sound becomes softer as the night deepens. The damp earth gives off a cool fragrance beneath the smoke, and pine resin remains sharp where new beams have been cut. A sentry moves along the wall, his boots pressing into wet planks. Somewhere below, a horse stamps once, then settles into silence. The monk's chanting has ended, but a single bell sounds from the chapel at the appointed hour. Parchment lies beneath a stone to keep it from curling in the moist air. On the table, the names Henry, Gregory, Saxony, and Rome stand beside one another in ink, awaiting decisions that will carry them into a more dangerous season. The royal and papal systems were approaching collision. Henry defended inherited practice, the rights of kingship, and the practical need to govern through bishops whose offices carried both spiritual and temporal responsibilities. Gregory defended ecclesiastical liberty, the authority of reform, and the principle that sacred office must not depend upon secular appointment. Neither man understood the other's position as a harmless difference of ceremony. Each feared that concession would damage the order he had sworn to preserve. The castles of Saxony had shown how quickly local resistance could become a challenge to the crown. The reform movement in Rome now suggested that the church could become an independent center of judgment over the conduct of rulers. Between Langensalza and Rome, between the wooded hills and the Roman Curia, two systems were drawing their lines. Henry IV and Gregory VII stood upon opposite sides of a question that reached far beyond any single wall, seal, or ceremony. The sound of public argument begins to narrow around you, leaving behind the quieter uncertainty of a king whose commands no longer travel evenly. In 1075, Gregory VII set out a forceful program of reform, placing a clear boundary before rulers who had long influenced episcopal appointments. You stand beside a wooden table where the text rests beneath a small stone weight, its parchment cool, its ink dark and faintly shining. The words carry the authority of Rome, yet their meaning reaches into every German hall, Italian town, and royal household where bishops are chosen. Around you, scribes lower their voices as they copy the language, while candles gutter in a draught beneath the heavy beams. The flame bends towards the doorway, then steadies, leaving thin shadows along the parchment and the coarse wool sleeves of the assembled clerks. Henry IV continues to intervene in the appointment of bishops, including contested appointments in Italy, where imperial influence meets the claims of reforming clergy. You hear the scrape of benches in a synod hall as men make room for envoys, messengers, and bishops whose loyalties remain difficult to read. Some appointments are treated by Henry as matters of royal government, while Gregory regards them as signs of an older disorder. Between these positions stands the question of who may confer spiritual office, and whether royal custom can survive a papal command. Cold air slips beneath the door, carrying the faint smell of damp wood and extinguished rushlights across the crowded floor. During 1075 and 1076, the dispute sharpens, and each exchange gives the quarrel a more public and dangerous shape. You are present in imagination among the German bishops, hearing Latin spoken carefully while the political meaning gathers beneath every formal phrase. Henry's representatives defend the rights of the crown, and Gregory's supporters insist that sacred office cannot be treated as royal property. Neither side describes its own position as an attack upon the order of Christendom, although each accusation makes the other appear responsible for disorder. Outside the hall, winter rain darkens the stones, and water gathers beneath the hoofprints of horses waiting beside the walls. At Worms on 24 January 1076, German bishops supporting Henry declare that Gregory should no longer be pope. You stand near the assembly as parchment shifts across the table, and the cold ink of the declaration dries beneath the narrow windows. The sentence is presented as a judgment upon Gregory's conduct, though its force depends upon the protection and authority of Henry himself. Henry addresses Gregory in hostile terms in a letter associated with the Worms assembly, giving the controversy a language of accusation and rejection. The letter crosses the mountains with couriers, enclosed within leather, sealed with wax, and carried along roads softened by winter rain. You imagine the messenger pausing at a roadside shelter, warming his fingers beside a smoky fire before continuing south. At Worms, the declaration against Gregory seems to strengthen the king's position, yet it also reveals how much the bishops depend upon royal power. At Rome, the letter is read as evidence that Henry has challenged the authority of the apostolic see itself. The narrow chamber holds the smell of wax, wool, and damp parchment, while a brazier gives more smoke than warmth. Gregory responds at the Roman Synod of February 1076, where the language of reform becomes a judgment upon the king. You are seated beyond the principal benches, close enough to hear the scrape of sandals and the measured movement of documents. Gregory excommunicates Henry IV and releases his subjects from their oaths of loyalty, presenting the decision as a spiritual consequence of royal defiance. The act is extraordinary because it treats a reigning king as subject to ecclesiastical judgment, rather than placing his authority beyond clerical correction. Around you, the synod remains solemn, and the scrape of benches sounds louder whenever a bishop rises or turns towards the central table. Gregory's supporters see the sentence as a defense of the church, while Henry's allies understand it as an attempt to dissolve obedience. The announcement travels north through roads still marked by snow, carried by letters whose seals break beneath impatient hands. In distant castles, men read the judgment beside firelight, measuring the danger of obeying a king whom Rome has placed under the ban. A thin wind moves through the courtyards, disturbing loose straw and lifting the edge of a discarded cloak. Henry's excommunication weakens his ability to command obedience from princes who are already dissatisfied with his rule. You watch the royal household grow quieter as messengers arrive without bringing certainty, while servants wait longer before carrying instructions onward. An oath of loyalty has always contained political meaning, yet its release by Gregory gives reluctant princes a language for resistance. The king remains crowned, wealthy, and surrounded by noble households, but the unquestioned character of obedience has begun to fade. In the northern districts, memories of conflict with Saxony remain close, and many princes calculate what the papal sentence may permit. The castle corridors hold the faint scent of wet leather, and every open door admits a blade of colorless winter light. Henry must now answer two dangers at once, for Gregory's spiritual judgment and the prince's political dissatisfaction reinforce one another. At Trebur in October 1076, German princes meet to consider the future of the monarchy under the shadow of the ban. You stand among muddy roads and temporary shelters, where horses stamp against the cold and banners hang heavily from their poles. The princes threaten to elect another king if Henry remains under the ban, making reconciliation a condition of continued rule. Their decision does not simply repeat Gregory's sentence, because it converts ecclesiastical condemnation into a practical test of royal survival. A king who cannot secure absolution may lose the allegiance of men who have not yet openly abandoned him. Rain settles upon the woolen coverings of the encampment, and the ground yields softly beneath the feet of messengers. At Trebur, the princes invite Gregory VII to participate in a future settlement at Augsburg, drawing the Pope directly into the resolution of German politics. You hear the names of Trebur and Augsburg repeated in low voices beside carts, chapel doors, and the temporary tables of noble households. The proposed meeting promises a formal settlement, yet its arrangements place Henry beneath conditions imposed by both princes and Pope. The prince's deadline makes absolution politically urgent for Henry, since delay could allow a rival king to gather recognition before his recovery. He cannot simply wait inside a royal residence, surrounded by the ordinary signs of authority, because time now favors those prepared to replace him. One messenger departs beneath a pale evening sky, while another arrives with news that changes the arrangement of the following day. At the edge of the camp, a distant bell passes through the thin winter air and disappears among the bare trees. Henry chooses to travel to Italy during the winter of 1076 to 1077, seeking a meeting with Gregory before the German settlement can remove him. You are beside the royal party as preparations begin, with provisions measured carefully and garments chosen for a journey across severe mountain roads. Henry crosses the Alps with a small entourage rather than leading a large army, keeping the journey swift and making its purpose unmistakable. The absence of a great force shows that he cannot safely rely upon intimidation, while the presence of trusted companions preserves the dignity of kingship. A political calculation, therefore, moves beneath the visible language of repentance, and each step southward serves more than one purpose. The road climbs through valleys where meltwater runs over mountain stone, bright beneath a sky stripped of autumn color. Leather reins stiff with frost press against gloved fingers, and the horses breathe clouds that vanish above their dark necks. No army fills the passes, and no mass of royal wagons announces conquest as the small company proceeds through the winter landscape. Henry's journey is therefore both a penitential act and a calculated attempt to prevent his deposition. You move with the travellers through narrow valleys, where the sound of hooves is softened by snow and distant bells drift across the slopes. A king approaching the Pope in penance acknowledges the seriousness of Gregory's judgment, even while seeking to change its political consequences. The journey does not settle the larger question of investiture, and it does not erase the declaration made at Worms. Instead, Henry seeks time, recognition, and the restoration of obedience before the princes can decide that another ruler should occupy his place. At night, the company rests beneath rough roofs, while frozen tack hangs from pegs and small fires burn low in iron bowls. Matilda of Tuscany, a powerful supporter of Gregory, controls Canossa Castle, where the mountain route meets the strongholds of northern Italy. You approach her lands through roads marked by old walls, vineyards sleeping beneath frost, and villages gathered close to their churches. Matilda's position gives Gregory protection, while her political strength makes Canossa more than a temporary refuge for a visiting pontiff. The castle stands above the surrounding country, its walls following the hard shape of the Apennine heights. Below, meltwater threads through dark channels, and the stone underfoot remains slick beneath the thin morning light. Gregory has gone to Canossa while waiting for the expected German meeting, placing himself within Matilda's territory before the royal arrival. You see the papal household behind the walls, where clerks prepare letters and attendants carry wood through passages chilled by the mountain air. The Pope has not travelled there merely to receive Henry, for Canossa also provides a secure position from which the German dispute may be judged. News of the king's approach reaches the castle gradually, first through riders, then through reports from villages beneath the slopes. Within the walls, candles gutter in a draught, leaving the corridors alternately warm with gold and cold with shadow. Henry comes towards Canossa without the settled certainty of a ruler entering a friendly court, yet without surrendering the calculations of kingship. You stand beneath the rising walls, looking upwards as the path narrows and snow gathers in hollows beside the stones. The royal company must negotiate with Matilda's people, and every request for passage or shelter carries the memory of the conflict. Henry's clothing and conduct can signify penance, but his purpose remains connected to the threat of deposition agreed at Trebur. A public ritual may restore the conditions under which political action becomes possible, even if the underlying disagreement remains unresolved. The cold air moves through the folds of travelling garments, bringing the smell of pine, horse, and distant wood smoke. At the foot of the Apennines, the journey becomes a waiting game between a king outside and a pope behind fortified walls. You are standing where the road bends beneath the mountain, with Canossa still above you and Gregory still concealed within its defences. Snow rests along the parapets, and thin water glimmers between the stones where the afternoon thaw has touched the path. The king's commands have travelled far less securely than before, while Gregory's sentence has reached princes who once stood beneath Henry's authority. Across the valley, a bell sounds briefly, carried through thin winter air before the mountains absorb the final note. Nothing in the quiet landscape resolves the contest, because the question has grown beyond the appointment of bishops and the rites of royal custom. The controversy has transformed church appointments into a direct contest over whether the Pope can judge a king. You remain beneath the walls of Canossa as the light fades, hearing leather shift, harness creak, and meltwater fall into the darkness. The declaration at Worms, the sentence of February 1076, and the threat made at Trebur now converge upon this narrow road. Henry IV has crossed the Alps in winter, and Gregory VII waits above him under Matilda of Tuscany's protection. The small royal entourage stands among frozen stones, while the castle keeps its silence and the next act remains unseen. Far above, a single candle moves behind a slit window, briefly illuminating the wall before vanishing into the depth of Canossa. Darkness. The January sky is pale enough to show the snow, yet too dim to reveal the full shape of the mountains around you. Cold air settles over the ravines, filling them with a blue-grey hush beneath the wooded slopes. Your boots press into crusted drifts where yesterday's travellers left shallow, wind-softened marks. The horses breathe in slow clouds, their nostrils bright with moisture, their dark coats powdered with frozen dust. Nearby, the wall of Canossa rises from the hill like a piece of night resting upon the snow. No bird moves among the bare branches, and the wind passes through them with a thin, dry murmur. Smoke from distant mountain dwellings drifts across the valley, carrying the faint scent of ash, damp wood, and boiled grain. The quiet beneath the fortress wall seems heavier than the darkness beyond it, as though the stone itself were waiting. Henry began his journey to Italy in the winter of 1076 to 1077, when the roads through the mountains were already difficult and uncertain. The season offered him no easy passage, because snow covered the tracks, ice formed upon the ledges, and swollen streams resisted every crossing. He travelled with a small party, and accounts of the journey include his wife Bertha and their young son Conrad among those moving southward. Such a household procession carried little resemblance to an invading army, and that appearance mattered greatly to Henry's purpose. The king needed to reach Italy without suggesting that he came at the head of a military invasion. Behind him, the German princes remained gathered in expectation, their decisions suspended until his position within the church could be repaired. Ahead, Gregory VII stayed at Canossa Castle, where Matilda of Tuscany had offered him protection and a place from which to judge the king's request. Every delay on the Alpine road, therefore, carried a political weight beyond the immediate hardship of snow, hunger, and exhausted animals. Henry was travelling towards absolution, yet the road itself forced him to move like a private man beneath the gaze of winter. The path narrows between walls of rock that hold the cold long after daylight has withdrawn. Wet leather stiffens around your feet, while rough alpine stone presses through the soles whenever the snow thins. A mule's harness creaks in a patient rhythm, interrupted by the dull scrape of a hoof searching for purchase. The party advances by short stages, stopping where a ledge widens enough for the animals to turn. At each halt, gloved hands gather around small flames, and sparks rise briefly before being swallowed by the air. The smoke smells of resinous branches, old wool, and the dark interiors of mountain dwellings. Thin ice glistens beside the track, reflecting the pale January sky in broken fragments. Far below, a village chimney releases a narrow column that bends immediately beneath the wind. The bare branches above you are black against the snow, and their fine twigs tremble without making any clear sound. Nothing in the landscape promises speed, and the mountains seem to measure time by endurance rather than distance. Contemporary accounts describe snow, ice, and arduous mountain travel, although their details vary according to the source and the purpose of its writer. Some descriptions emphasize the physical severity of the crossing, while others concentrate upon the moral meaning later assigned to Henry's hardship. The journey has therefore never come to us as a single, perfectly observed sequence of events. What can be seen with confidence is a king descending through winter terrain while his enemies and allies waited for the result. Bertha travelled beside Henry according to accounts of the passage, and Conrad, still young, formed part of the fragile royal household. Their presence made the expedition intimate as well as political, since the road carried a family through conditions that tested every ordinary provision. Clothing became wet, food became scarce, and the choice of shelter depended upon the goodwill of communities scattered along the mountain routes. A larger armed force would have consumed supplies and announced its intentions, so the small party preserved both practical mobility and diplomatic ambiguity. Henry had to arrive as a penitent king rather than as a commander forcing entry into Italy. That distinction guided the movement of the entire winter journey. Snow glare gathers beneath the pale January sky, even where the sun remains hidden behind the upper ridges. The brightness hurts your eyes for a moment, then fades as cloud passes over the slopes. A horse shakes its mane, sending small crystals from the hair around its neck. The leather reins feel cold and damp, and the metal fittings leave a sharp impression against your fingers. Ahead, the track disappears beneath a smooth field of wind-packed snow, leaving only a line of stones to indicate its direction. Someone has placed branches at the edge of a dangerous drop, though several have been bent flat by weather. Below the path, ravines descend into shadow, their depths concealed by firs and drifting white vapor. A mountain dwelling appears briefly between the trunks, its walls brown with age and its doorway bright with firelight. Smoke touches the road, and the smell of burning beechwood remains around you after the house has vanished behind the slope. The wind moves through the bare branches again, softening every human sound into the broad silence of the pass. At intervals, the royal party entered mountain communities where local knowledge became more valuable than royal authority. Guides could identify a ford beneath the ice, a stable still holding hay, or a path that remained open after a night of snowfall. The people encountered along the route would have understood that important travelers were passing, even if they knew little of the dispute between king and pope. News traveled quickly through such places, carried by merchants, clergy, muleteers, and men who had crossed the same roads in better seasons. The name of Henry IV moved ahead of the party, accompanied by rumors of excommunication, German rebellion, and an uncertain meeting at Canossa. His wife Bertha and their son Conrad made the royal procession recognizable as a household, but they could not make the danger less immediate. Every shelter offered warmth for a night, yet each morning returned the travelers to ice, steep ground, and the uncertain distance ahead. The small party passed beneath ridges where larger political forces had no visible presence, though their pressure seemed to surround every decision. German princes waited beyond the mountains, Matilda watched over the fortress, and Gregory held the power to determine whether Henry could speak as a Christian king. The winter road connected these distant intentions through the movement of a few exhausted bodies. The slope below the dwellings is patched with snow, exposed grass, and dark stones slick with meltwater. You walk where the path allows, then step aside as a laden animal passes close enough for its flank to brush your sleeve. Warm breath rises around the horses and hangs in the air before breaking into faint ribbons. A wooden wheel turns slowly through frozen mud, its rim clicking against buried rock. From an unseen house comes the low knock of an axe, followed by the brief crack of a branch splitting. The smell of smoke is stronger here, mingled with wool leather, and the sour warmth of animals kept beneath the same roof. A bell sounds somewhere across the valley, but the mountain returns only a blurred echo. The pale sky rests above the ridges like worn cloth, without color enough to separate cloud from snow. Bare branches bend in the wind, and a little powder slips from them onto the road. For a while, the only clear sound is the careful placing of feet upon the frozen ground. The route across the Alps was difficult not merely because the mountains were high, but because winter altered every familiar measure of travel. Distances described by summer roads became unreliable when bridges disappeared beneath snow or when a pass was closed by ice. A journey that might have been demanding in fare, weather became an exercise in waiting, searching, and accepting the limits of animals and men. Henry's progress could not be separated from these delays, because political urgency did not melt the roads or lengthen the daylight. Contemporary writers remembered the crossing as an ordeal, though they shaped its meaning according to later arguments about royal dignity and papal power. The hardships could be read as evidence of humility, as proof of determination, or as material for a story in which a mighty ruler was brought low. Yet the immediate purpose was practical and precise. Henry needed release from excommunication before the German assembly planned at Augsburg could proceed without him. He wanted the right to negotiate with the German princes as a king within the church, rather than as a ruler placed outside Christian communion. The Alps did not decide that question, but they carried him towards the person who could influence its answer. By January 1077, the mountain road had become a corridor between political exclusion and renewed negotiation. Cloud gathers along the upper slopes and leaves the lower valley strangely bright. Snow lies in rounded folds against the roots of the trees, while exposed rock shows the dark colors of slate and granite. Your feet find a narrow strip of frozen earth between the bank and the drop, each step sounding dull beneath the packed surface. The cold enters through wet sandals or boots and remains there, quiet and persistent, despite the warmth of movement. A leather strap has hardened into a narrow ridge, and a buckle feels almost painful when touched without a glove. The horses lower their heads against the wind, their breath clouding around them like smoke from a small hidden fire. Branches scrape lightly together above the path, making a dry sound that rises and fades without rhythm. From the valley comes the scent of wood smoke, faint enough to be imagined, then suddenly clear when the air shifts. The road curves around a shoulder of stone, and the fortress is still absent from sight. Only the whiteness of the slopes and the immense quiet indicate that the travelers are approaching a place where history will narrow into ritual. Henry reached northern Italy in January 1077, entering the lands ruled by Matilda of Tuscany after crossing the Alps in winter. The change of territory did not remove the cold, and the roads beneath the Apennines remained steep, wooded, and difficult. Matilda's lands formed a political space in which the king could request access to Gregory without immediately confronting a hostile army. Gregory VII was staying at Canossa Castle under Matilda's protection, and the arrangement placed the Pope beyond Henry's direct command. The castle was a hilltop fortress in the northern Italian Apennines, set above ravines, wooded slopes, and winter roads. Its position gave the Pope security, while Matilda's presence created a channel through which messages could pass between the two sides. Henry's arrival therefore presented Matilda with a delicate task, since she had to mediate between a king seeking restoration and a pope defending ecclesiastical authority. She acted as an important intermediary, carrying the weight of her family, her territory, and her relationship with Gregory. The encounter could not be reduced to a simple meeting between two isolated men, because Matilda's protection made the meeting possible. In January 1077, Canossa became the place where royal urgency met papal hesitation beneath the supervision of a powerful Italian ruler. The castle appears above the landscape as a dark shape against slopes covered with snow. Its walls follow the uneven crown of the hill, and their edges seem to grow from the rock beneath them. A narrow road climbs through bare woodland, passing walls that hold old moisture and patches of ice. Ravines open on either side, the depths filled with shadow where the January light cannot reach. You smell smoke from dwellings scattered below, though no flames are visible through the trees. The wind presses along the hillside and moves the branches in long, uneven waves. Every exposed stone is cold to the touch, carrying a thin skin of frost that breaks beneath a glove. The fortress wall remains quiet, without a shout from the gate or the clatter of men preparing for battle. Beyond the wall, unseen rooms hold clerks, guards, servants, and a pope whose decision has become inseparable from the fate of a king. Above the road, Canossa keeps its silence, and the small party waits within the narrow space between arrival and admission. Henry did not come to Canossa simply to display suffering, although suffering became central to the way later generations remembered the event. His arrival placed Gregory in an awkward position, because refusing absolution might appear to deny Christian mercy to a penitent ruler. Granting absolution, however, could restore Henry's political freedom and allow him to negotiate with the German princes from a stronger position. The Pope therefore faced a problem in which sacramental judgment and political consequence could not be separated. Gregory could not simply ignore the significance of public penance, because Christian reconciliation required attention to the visible condition of the offender. Nor could he disregard the political meaning of restoring a king who had been declared excommunicate. Henry's request was spiritual in form, yet its consequences reached into elections, oaths, royal government, and the balance between crown and church. Matilda understood this tension, and her mediation helped prevent the approach from becoming an immediate contest of force. The king waited below the fortress, while the Pope considered how mercy might be granted without appearing to surrender authority. In that pause, the walls of Canossa contained not only a religious decision, but the uncertain future of the German kingdom. Snow has settled upon the ledges of the fortress, forming narrow white lines beneath the darker masonry. A gust crosses the hill and carries loose crystals over the road, where they slide like fine sand across frozen ground. The air smells of cold stone and distant fires, with a trace of damp wood caught beneath the sharper mountain wind. You hear the muffled movement of animals behind a nearby wall, followed by the soft ring of a chain against timber. A guard might be standing above the gate, though the height and shadow conceal any human outline. The castle's ravines fall away into a grey distance, where trees gather closely around the hidden roads. January light rests upon the snow without warmth, and the exposed rock beneath your boots remains dark and wet. A horse stamps once, then stands still, its breath rising in a broad cloud around its head. The bare branches make a fine net against the sky, and the wind passes through them with the sound of distant water. Under the fortress wall, the waiting becomes almost motionless, as though time itself has been held in the cold. The precise choreography of the encounter is reported differently by medieval sources, and no single account can be accepted without caution. Some narratives emphasize prolonged waiting outside the castle, while others organize the event more tightly around the formal act of penance. Later retellings develop the famous image of Henry barefoot in the snow, dressed in the visual language of extreme humiliation. Descriptions of penitential waiting do support the broader impression that Henry stood in a position of deliberate submission. The exact physical details, however, should be treated cautiously, because writers shape the scene according to theological, political, and literary purposes. The image of bare feet has become powerful precisely because it is simple, visible, and easy to remember across centuries. The historical event was more complex, involving access, mediation, ritual language, and the uncertain timing of decisions inside the castle. What remains well attested is that Henry performed penance before Canossa and sought release from excommunication. The core event does not depend upon every later detail of clothing, snow, or the number of days spent waiting. Its meaning lies in the encounter between a king who needed restoration and a pope who possessed the authority to grant it. The snow beneath the wall is uneven, hardened where many feet have passed, and soft where the wind has gathered it anew. A thin stream of meltwater runs beside the stones, freezing again wherever the shade deepens. Your hands rest near your body for warmth, while the cold stiffens the fabric at your wrists and shoulders. From somewhere within the fortress comes a muted closing of wood, then no further movement reaches the road. Smoke drifts above the parapet, and disappears into the white sky, leaving only a faint scent of ash. The wall is rough beneath your gaze, marked by seams, cracks, and small ledges where frost has formed. No torch burns openly above the gate, and the absence of light makes the fortress seem less inhabited than it is. A single bird crosses the ravine and vanishes behind the trees before its wings can be heard. The snow reflects the sky with a dull, steady glare, while the dark slopes gather quietly around Canossa. Waiting beneath stone has its own texture, made from cold air, restrained breath, and the steady knowledge that speech is being considered elsewhere. Matilda of Tuscany acted as the necessary intermediary between king and pope, and her role gave the encounter its particular shape. She belonged to the Italian political world that Henry had entered, yet she also possessed a relationship with Gregory that made her protection meaningful. Messages could be carried, requests could be softened, and the possibility of violence could be held at a distance. Without Matilda, Henry's arrival might have produced a confrontation in which the king and pope faced each other without a trusted channel between them. Her intervention did not erase the disagreement over royal authority, but it created the conditions in which penance could be recognized. The castle belonged to her political sphere, while the excommunication belonged to Gregory's spiritual jurisdiction. Henry's small party occupied the road below, representing a royal household stripped of the usual outward signs of force. Bertha and the young Conrad remained part of the journey's human reality, even when later stories focused almost entirely upon Henry's body. Their presence suggests the vulnerability of the expedition, since a family crossing winter mountains could not easily withdraw once the fortress had been reached. Matilda stood between these forms of power, making Canossa a place of negotiation rather than a simple stage for humiliation. Frost outlines the branches along the road, turning each twig into a pale, delicate line. The hillside smells of pine resin, damp bark, and the smoke of homes hidden beyond the lower trees. A servant leads a tired horse towards a sheltered hollow, where the snow has been trampled into grey ridges. The animal's breath rises around its muzzle, and its hooves make small sounds against the frozen earth. You can feel moisture drying upon your outer clothing, leaving the cloth stiff in places and heavy in others. Above, the fortress remains dark beneath the overcast sky, its windows narrow and difficult to distinguish from gaps in the stone. Wind moves through the woodland and causes a loose shutter somewhere below to tap at regular intervals. The noise is not loud, yet it gives the valley a faint human pulse. A road bends towards the gate, bordered by snow-covered stones that mark the edge of the steep descent. The quiet beneath Canossa is not empty, because every concealed room and sheltered path contains someone waiting for the next decision. When Henry reached Canossa in January 1077, he arrived before the planned German assembly at Augsburg could determine his future without him. The timing was essential, because delay might allow the princes to proceed with a settlement that excluded or replaced him. Henry's objective was to regain the right to negotiate with those princes as a king within the church. He did not need immediate victory over Gregory in order to preserve his position, but he did need the barrier of excommunication removed. A king under excommunication could be portrayed as unfit to rule, and his opponents could use that condition to justify further action. Public penance offered Henry a way to alter the political field by presenting himself as reconciled rather than condemned. For Gregory, the same act provided an opportunity to affirm the church's authority over a ruler without simply destroying the monarchy. The outcome depended upon a balance between visible humility and preserved royal status. At Canossa, Henry sought a form of mercy that would reopen politics, while Gregory sought a form of mercy that would not weaken the principle behind the sentence. The road had brought them to a moment where absolution could change the language in which every later negotiation would be conducted. A pale brightness lies along the snow where the day begins to thin through the clouds. The castle wall receives no warmth from it, and the stones remain blue, wet, and deeply cold. Drops fall from an overhanging ledge, striking the ground with a quiet sound before freezing into small clear beads. The smell of smoke rises from the valley in intermittent breaths, sometimes sharp with resin and sometimes softened by distance. You hear boots shifting on the road, though no one speaks loudly enough for the words to be understood. The horses stand close together, their bodies giving off a faint warmth that disappears into the morning air. Bare branches scrape the upper wall when the wind turns, leaving a brief whisper against the stone. Snow glare spreads beneath the pale January sky and makes the darker figure seem almost weightless. The ravines below remain covered in shadow, while the wooded slopes show narrow paths winding between the trees. Nothing moves upon the battlements, yet the fortress feels awake, listening through its silence to the figures gathered below. The king's penance did not erase the political conflict that had brought him to the mountain. It created a temporary settlement in which Gregory could grant release from excommunication while preserving the seriousness of Henry's submission. The episode saved Henry's position temporarily, but it did not settle the dispute over royal authority or investiture. The questions surrounding the appointment of bishops, the limits of kingship, and the independence of the church remained unresolved. Henry had crossed the Alps to secure room for negotiation, not to end every disagreement between the German monarchy and the papacy. Gregory had received a public act that acknowledged his authority, yet he could not control all the consequences of restoring Henry to communion. The German princes still possessed their own interests, and the political struggle continued beyond the walls of Canossa. The dramatic image of a ruler humbled before a pope later obscured the careful calculations made by both men. A simple story of humiliation could not contain the roles of Bertha, Conrad, Matilda, the German nobles, and the approaching assembly at Augsburg. Canossa was therefore both a religious reconciliation and a political maneuver whose effects extended far beyond the January snow. The road beneath the fortress has begun to darken as daylight gathers elsewhere. Snow clings to the lower stones, while the upper wall absorbs the grey light and becomes almost black. Your breath moves before you in a small cloud, joining the vapor rising from the horses. A cold drop touches the back of your hand from a branch overhead, then slips away beneath the cuff. Smoke from the mountain dwellings lies low across the valley, carrying the familiar scent of ash and split wood. The wind has weakened, but the bare branches still tremble with the movement left behind. A strip of ice shines beside the track, smooth as glass, except where a boot has broken its surface. From the castle comes the faint scrape of a bolt being drawn, followed by a pause that seems longer than the night. The wall above you remains still, and the ravines hold their shadow beneath the wooded slopes. Then a narrow opening appears within the gate, admitting a little darkness that is different from the darkness outside. Inside Canossa, the terms of reconciliation had to be arranged through words, gestures, and forms of authority that medieval observers understood differently. The sources disagree over the exact sequence, but they preserve the sense of a formal encounter shaped by penance. Henry's submission could be seen as a Christian act before God, a legal act before the church, and a political act before the German princes. Gregory's response likewise carried several meanings, since absolution affected both Henry's sacramental condition and his ability to govern. The Pope could not simply ignore public penance, because doing so would make mercy appear impossible even for a ruler who submitted. Nor could he grant forgiveness, as though the conflict had been a private matter, without consequences for the Christian order. Matilda's mediation helped hold these meanings together, until a form of admission became possible. The king was not restored to unlimited authority, and the disagreement over investiture did not disappear at the gate. Yet the immediate danger had shifted, because Henry was no longer standing entirely outside the church's recognized communion. The balance between the two men altered abruptly when the fortress admitted him. The gate opens farther, and warmer air reaches the road with the faint odor of smoke, wool, and enclosed animals. Your face remains cold, but the sharpest wind has fallen behind the wall. A torch burns somewhere beyond the entrance, its light reflected in wet stones and patches of trampled snow. The flame is small, and its glow cannot reach the upper battlements where frost still clings to the masonry. Footprints lead inward across the threshold, overlapping until their separate shapes become one dark path. The horses lower their heads as the party begins to move, and their breath gathers beneath the arch. Wooden beams show black against the torchlight, polished by hands and shoulders over many seasons. The smell of ash is stronger inside, joined by the dry scent of rushes scattered across the floor. Behind you, the ravines and winter roads fade into the colorless morning, while bare branches move beyond the gate. The quiet beneath the fortress wall gives way to the close, muffled stillness of the passage. The Alpine crossing became one of the most enduring scenes in medieval political history, because it placed immense authority within a small physical space. A king, a pope, and a Tuscan ruler were gathered around a question that reached from private conscience to the structure of Europe. Later memory preferred the visible figure of Henry in the snow, since the image made power, submission, and reversal immediately clear. But the winter journey involved more than a single posture before a wall. It included the slow movement of a royal family, the danger of mountain roads, the protection offered by Matilda, and the calculations of Gregory. The sources preserve certainty about penance while leaving uncertainty around the exact staging of the waiting. That distinction allows the event to remain vivid without requiring every later detail to be treated as literal observation. Henry had performed penance before Canossa, sought release from excommunication, and gained the temporary freedom required to continue bargaining. The act restored movement to his political position, though it did not restore the old relationship between king and pope. What entered the castle in January 1077 was a penitent ruler, but what emerged was still a monarch engaged in a struggle over authority. Within the fortress, the air feels warmer only by comparison with the mountains. Torchlight moves across rough walls, revealing damp patches, old repairs, and grains of grit caught in the mortar. The floor beneath your boots is hard and uneven, with straw gathered along the edges where feet have passed. Smoke hangs near the ceiling, turning the light soft and brown before it escapes through a narrow opening. The sound of the outer wind has become distant, reduced to a low pressure around the stones. Somewhere beyond the passage, a door closes gently, and footsteps answer from another room. The cold still clings to clothing, hair, and leather, carrying the smell of snow into the sheltered interior. A servant leads the horses away, and their breathing fades beneath the heavier quiet of the castle. The walls seem to hold the outside darkness in their thickness, while the torches mark a careful route forward. Nothing here resembles triumph, yet the simple warmth of the passage indicates that the balance has begun to change. Gregory's decision to admit Henry did not mean that the Pope had abandoned his claims concerning royal authority. The absolution restored Henry to the Church's community, but the broader conflict over investiture awaited further arguments, alliances, and reversals. Henry could now approach the German princes with a different political standing, though they remained free to resist him. Gregory could present the penance as evidence that kings were answerable to spiritual judgment, even when they possessed armies and crowns. Matilda could claim neither complete victory nor neutrality. but her role had helped prevent the meeting from ending in violence or permanent exclusion. The temporary settlement was therefore effective precisely because it did not solve the whole dispute. It answered the immediate question of excommunication while leaving the deeper contest open for later years. The famous humiliation at Canossa was consequently less a final defeat than a momentary rearrangement of political possibilities. Henry had crossed the Alps to save his position, and for a time the road achieved its purpose. Beyond the castle, however, German politics continued to move, and the authority of a king remained a matter of dispute. Torchlight rests upon the inner stones, while a pale stripe of daylight enters through the gate behind you. Snow glare still lies outside beneath the January sky, but the brightness is now softened by distance and walls. The smell of mountain smoke has become faint, replaced by warm wool, damp timber, and the mineral scent of old masonry. A narrow draught passes along the floor, carrying a final thread of cold through the enclosed passage. You can hear the muted stir of servants, the small ring of metal, and the soft shifting of straw beneath a foot. The fortress above the ravines seems less like a distant shape now, though its thick walls remain severe and watchful. Bare branches move beyond the gate, their dark forms crossing the whiteness of the slopes. The wind through them is barely audible from within, like a memory of the road left outside. The horses have disappeared into another court, and the passage has settled into a slower rhythm. Behind the doorway, the winter journey waits in silence, while ahead, the king is brought into the castle. Henry IV entered Canossa in January 1077 as a ruler whose outward humility had secured a renewed place within the church. The journey from the winter Alps had not made the dispute disappear, but it had altered the conditions under which the dispute could continue. Gregory could no longer treat Henry as simply excommunicate, and Henry could no longer pretend that royal command stood beyond ecclesiastical judgment. Matilda's mediation had brought them into a shared space where neither side possessed complete control. The exact choreography of the encounter remained uncertain in the sources, while the central fact of penance remained firm. Later generations would remember snow, bare feet, and a king waiting outside a fortress wall. The fuller scene contained more restrained elements: delay, negotiation, family travel, political calculation, and the difficult mercy of absolution. Canossa offered Henry temporary relief before Augsburg, yet it offered no permanent answer to the question of who could appoint, command, or judge. The castle had received the king, and the political balance had abruptly altered, though only for a season. Outside, winter still covered the roads, and the Alps kept their silence over everything that would follow. You are standing in the winter country beneath the walls of Canossa, where January snow darkens beneath the feet of those moving between the castle and the valley. Henry has arrived before Gregory VII, not with the confidence of a crowned ruler, but with the burden of excommunication resting visibly upon him. The road has brought him through cold passes, guarded villages, and territories where obedience to the king has become uncertain. Around you, the penitential journey has narrowed into a small circle of waiting, prayer, and negotiation. Canossa is no longer merely a fortress above the Apennines, because Henry's presence has made it the meeting place of royal necessity and papal judgment. The castle stones hold the winter cold long after daylight fades. Beneath those walls, Henry performs penance before Gregory VII in January 1077, while German princes watch from a distance and measure what mercy might mean. Snow lies in uneven ridges along the path, pressed flat where many feet have passed, and untouched beside the walls. The pale surface receives each step with a soft collapse, while darker earth appears beneath the shoes of servants carrying bundles, firewood, and food. A wooden gate opens with a hollow sound, then settles again into its iron fittings. In the courtyard, Prayer is whispered in the cold, each voice lowered by the surrounding stone and by the knowledge that every gesture may be observed. The air carries the faint smell of damp wool, extinguished embers, and leather softened by travel. Winter rain moves across the distant hills, gathering beneath the grey sky before falling in thin, uncertain strands. You feel the cold air passing across your face as bells sound somewhere within the castle, their notes softened by snow. Nothing appears hurried, although every hour presses upon the men waiting outside. For 3 days, Henry remains in penitential expectation, and the rhythm of those days is shaped by delay rather than spectacle. You follow him from the outer spaces of the fortress towards the chapel, then back again into the hard light of the courtyard. Gregory does not simply meet the king as one ruler meets another, because Henry's arrival has been arranged as an appeal for restoration within the church. The king's bare feet, his prayer, and his waiting express a submission that belongs to religious discipline as much as political calculation. Yet calculation has not vanished from the scene. Henry needs absolution before the German princes can easily present his excommunication as the sole reason for deposing him. Gregory must decide whether mercy will strengthen papal authority or allow the king to recover his freedom of action. Canossa holds both possibilities within its narrow gates. The hours pass beneath a sky that seems to have forgotten the color blue. Meltwater gathers in shallow channels and carries fragments of straw towards the lower slope. A servant closes a shutter against the winter rain, and the wooden panel answers with a dull knock. Smoke from the kitchens drifts low across the yard, bearing the gentle bitterness of olive oil and damp ash. You hear murmured prayers rising and fading beside the chapel wall, never loud enough to become a public declaration. The fabric of cloaks grows heavy at the shoulders, and wet hems leave irregular marks upon the stone. Near the gate, a horse shifts in its harness and scatters a little snow from the timber rail. At dusk, the light settles upon the fortress like thin wool, revealing the roughness of the masonry and the tracks crossing the courtyard. The cold does not explain the waiting, but it gives the waiting a physical weight. On the 3rd day, Gregory VII grants Henry absolution, and the king is lifted from the condition that has suspended him outside ordinary communion. The excommunication is removed after the penitential encounter, restoring Henry to communion within the church. You can imagine the change not as a sudden cheer, but as the gradual loosening of a cord drawn tightly around every political exchange. Henry may again bargain with bishops, receive support from nobles, and approach the German princes without carrying the immediate mark of exclusion. His enemies have lost the simplest justification for deposing him solely because he is excommunicated. The absolution therefore gives Henry room to breathe, travel, and gather strength. It does not give Gregory permanent control over Henry's kingship, and it does not transform the king into a servant of the papal court. Canossa has altered the balance while leaving its central question unresolved. By morning, the snow has become granular beneath the traffic of men and animals. Water drips from the roof edges, striking the stones at measured intervals that resemble a quiet clock. The courtyard smells of wool, ash, and the clean mineral scent released by rain. A prayer continues behind a closed door, its syllables blending with the creak of timber and the faint scrape of a bucket. You stand beneath the wall and see how footprints divide around puddles, some leading towards the chapel, others descending towards the road. The wooden gate gives its hollow note whenever a messenger passes through, carrying news towards distant settlements. Beyond the battlements, the hills are softened by mist, and the winter air carries no clear sign of spring. In Italy, olive smoke rises from a low roof and mingles with the dampness of the weather. The landscape remains quiet, although the settlement has already begun to move politics elsewhere. The German princes do not accept Canossa as the end of their dispute with Henry. In March 1077, they elect Rudolf of Rheinfelden as an opposing king, establishing a rival centre of authority within the German kingdom. You follow the news northward through roads that are less forgiving than the castle courtyard, where thawing ground becomes mud and every bridge carries rumours. Rudolf is not merely a convenient name placed against Henry's own, because his election gathers princes who believe that royal authority must be limited by their collective judgment. Henry's absolution has removed the immediate religious pretext for deposition, yet it has not removed the political distrust created before and after Canossa. Two kings now claim the same kingdom, and the German conflict becomes a civil war shaped by oaths, episcopal alliances, fortified towns, and competing interpretations of lawful rule. Henry has regained communion, but his enemies have not disappeared. The northern roads open beneath low clouds, with patches of snow remaining where hedges protect the ground from the weak sun. Hooves break the frozen crust, and wheels press dark lines through the thaw. You pass villages where smoke hangs close to the thatched roofs, carrying the smell of peat, cabbage, and wet timber. At a river crossing, brown water moves swiftly beneath branches stripped bare by winter. The wind enters through the seams of your cloak and leaves your hands stiff around the reins. Church doors stand open for morning prayer, while the bronze hinges complain softly whenever the panels move. Along the road, small groups of armed men rest beside carts, their mail dulled by mud and their boots crusted with frozen earth. Nothing in the countryside resembles a single united command. Each bell, bridge, and manor seems to belong to a different promise, and every promise may be tested before the next season ends. You spend the following years beside Henry as he fights Rudolf and the forces supporting him. Battles interrupt negotiations, and negotiations interrupt battles, producing no clean division between the movement of armies and the movement of letters. Henry must secure towns, persuade bishops, and retain the loyalty of men who understand that a royal defeat may alter their lands as much as their consciences. Rudolf's supporters present their king as a defender of lawful order, while Henry's supporters insist that the crown cannot be made dependent upon a temporary gathering of princes. The memory of Canossa remains active in every argument, because the king's penance has demonstrated both the reach of papal authority and the usefulness of royal submission. You see Henry rebuilding his position through patience, force, and the ordinary work of rule. Canossa has given him time, but time has become a road filled with armed companions. In the forests, rain gathers upon branches before falling in heavy drops onto the leaf litter below. The smell of wet bark rises around the marching column, mixed with horse sweat and the faint smoke of cooking fires. You hear leather straps creaking, spear shafts touching against one another, and distant crows calling from trees hidden by mist. Mud clings to the soles of boots until each step becomes a small effort of release. At night, water beads upon shields leaned against wagons, and the firelight gives every metal edge a brief, wavering color. A chapel bell sounds from beyond the fields, its note carried thinly through the rain. The men lower their voices when speaking of Rudolf, since the rival king's name has become part of the daily weather of the kingdom. Beneath a cloak, a folded letter softens at the corners, while the road continues beneath a sky without stars. In 1080, Gregory VII excommunicates Henry again, renewing the spiritual conflict that Canossa had temporarily eased. You stand with Henry at the moment when absolution's political advantage begins to narrow, because the king's restored communion has not produced obedience to papal demands. Gregory's second excommunication declares that the disagreement over royal authority remains alive beneath every settlement. Henry responds by supporting the election of Guibert of Ravenna as antipope Clement III, giving his cause an alternative spiritual center. The conflict now possesses rival kings and rival popes, each supported by networks of nobles, bishops, cities, and armed retainers. Henry's struggle is no longer only a contest over whether he may appoint churchmen. It has become a dispute over the shape of Christian government and the right to define legitimate authority within the empire. Canossa has receded into memory, yet its consequences still guide every new decision. Rain falls against the shutters of an inn where the night gathers early. The room smells of straw, old smoke, and oil warming in a shallow lamp. You hear the muted movement of animals below, followed by the occasional knock of a hoof against wood. A courier removes his wet gloves beside the hearth and lays a sealed message upon the table. Its wax is dark, its edges marked by travel, and the writing inside will carry news of excommunication, elections, and armies. Outside, the road has become a narrow ribbon of black mud between fields shining under the clouds. Water runs from the eaves in continuous threads, while the fire gives little warmth beyond the stones around it. Somewhere beyond the settlement, prayer is being whispered in a cold courtyard, preserving a rhythm older than the quarrels of kings. The lamp flame bends whenever the door opens, and the smell of winter rain enters with the messenger. In 1081, Henry's forces enter Italy during a renewed struggle with Gregory, and the movement southward places the king once more within the reach of Rome. You travel with the army through valleys where the winter light rests upon olive trees and pale stone walls. Henry's passage is supported by men who see Clement III as a necessary answer to Gregory's claims, while Gregory's allies prepare to endure another siege. The journey does not resemble a triumphant procession because every mile requires supplies, agreements, and the management of rival loyalties. Italian cities possess their own memories of imperial rule, papal privilege, and local independence, and each city must decide what Henry's presence will mean. In 1081, the princes also elect Hermann of Salm as another opposing king in Germany. Hermann remains a rival until 1088, ensuring that Henry's authority is contested in the north while his army struggles in Italy. The Italian winter carries a different dampness, though it settles with equal persistence upon cloaks and leather. Olive smoke rises from village kitchens, faintly sweet and bitter at once, before dissolving into winter rain. You walk across a road where Roman stones lie beneath mud, their old surfaces appearing briefly whenever a cartwheel clears the water. The air tastes of ash, wet earth, and the green sharpness of crushed leaves. Along a hillside, bare vines twist through wooden supports, and small streams gather beneath bridges darkened by centuries. Soldiers' sandals and boots leave prints among broken tiles, while pack animals breathe white vapor into the cold. In the distance, bronze church doors close at dusk, their deep sound carrying across roofs and courtyards. The evening light turns the rain silver for a moment, then leaves the road to darkness, where olive smoke continues rising from unseen fires. Rome resists Henry during his first approach, and the struggle lasts longer than the distance between the army and the city walls. You remain among the encampments while negotiations pass between commanders, clergy, and Roman factions. Gregory VII continues in opposition, refusing to accept Henry's settlement with Clement III or the political claims carried by the imperial army. The king must therefore combine pressure upon Rome with support for the antipope whose election he has helped create. In 1084, Henry captures Rome, changing the practical circumstances of the conflict without ending its deeper argument. The city is entered through gates that have witnessed emperors, generals, pilgrims, and processions, yet the old stones cannot make the new authority permanent. Within Rome, Henry receives an imperial coronation from Clement III in 1084. The crown returns in ceremony, while Gregory's cause survives beyond the captured streets. The approach to Rome is marked by dust rather than snow, although the air remains heavy with winter moisture. Roman dust rises beneath marching sandals and settles upon greaves, hems, and the dull surfaces of shields. You hear the uneven tread of men crossing old paving stones, each step answering against walls built for other centuries. Rain has darkened the arches, and water gathers in the hollows between ancient blocks. Near a campfire, olive smoke drifts low beneath a canopy, mingling with the smell of boiled grain and damp wool. The city walls appear and disappear through mist, while watchmen move along the parapets with lanterns shielded from the wind. At dusk, bronze church doors close with a grave reverberation, leaving the streets beyond them enclosed in shadow. The Roman night holds the murmurs of soldiers, the creak of wagons, and the distant tolling of bells that refuse to belong entirely to any one claimant. Clement III crowns Henry emperor in Rome in 1084, and the ceremony gives visible form to a victory that has required years of war. You stand within the ordered movement of vestments, candles, prayers, and imperial symbols, watching a crown pass from contested hands into the ceremony of Roman rule. The coronation confirms Henry's imperial dignity in the eyes of those who support Clement, yet it cannot compel Gregory VII to recognize the arrangement. Gregory remains in opposition, surrounded by danger as the political balance inside Rome shifts against him. Norman forces eventually rescue Gregory from the city, carrying him away from the immediate reach of Henry and Clement. The escape turns the imperial celebration into another stage of displacement, since the Pope's authority continues through exile rather than submission. Rome has given Henry an emperor's crown, but it has not given him an uncontested empire or a final answer about papal authority. The streets around the Lateran hold the smell of rain trapped in old stone. You pass beneath arches where water drips from carved surfaces and leaves dark trails upon the paving. Torches hiss when wind carries moisture against their flames, and the light breaks across bronze fittings, wet leather, and polished ceremonial cloth. Behind a closed church door, prayer continues in a low current, almost hidden beneath the footsteps outside. Roman dust clings to the edges of sandals even after rain has fallen, making each movement carry a trace of the road. A mule turns its head towards the smell of grain, while a distant dog answers the voices of men returning to camp. The church doors close at dusk, and their sound travels through the narrow streets before fading beneath the rain. You feel the city becoming quieter, though the silence contains watchfulness rather than peace. Gregory VII dies in exile at Salerno on 25 May 1085, after the Norman rescue has carried him away from Rome. You follow the road south through a country of wet hills, olive groves, and settlements gathered around small churches. His final years do not erase the authority he has exercised, because exile can preserve a claim even when possession has been lost. Gregory's death leaves Henry with a military success and an imperial crown, yet the reforming program associated with the Pope continues to move through other hands. The conflict has become larger than the personal opposition between Henry and Gregory, since questions about ecclesiastical independence, royal appointment, and the limits of papal judgment remain unresolved. The events at Canossa have not vanished, but they no longer contain the whole dispute. At Salerno on 25 May 1085, Gregory dies beyond Rome, while the arguments he carried continue northward and across the Alps. The coast near Salerno receives winter rain in long, slanting lines. You stand where wet stones descend towards dark water, with olive smoke rising from houses behind you. The sea gives a broad, muffled sound beneath the weather, and gulls pass briefly through the grey air before disappearing. Salt gathers upon the edges of wooden boats, while ropes darken and swell beside the quay. In the distance, church bells move through the rain with a softened tone, answering one another across the slopes. Roman dust no longer covers the road here, yet small grains remain caught within sandals and the folds of travelling garments. A priest closes a bronze door against the evening, and the metal speaks once before the interior becomes quiet. The cold air carries damp stone, extinguished charcoal, and the faint green scent of olive leaves. Salerno holds Gregory's final exile in a landscape that seems both enclosed and open to every road beyond it. After Gregory's death, Henry's imperial coronation does not end the conflict over papal authority. You remain within a world where the crown in Rome has settled one immediate question while leaving many others open. Clement III possesses the support of Henry and his allies, but rival claims continue to circulate through monasteries, episcopal courts, and princely households. Reformers do not accept that a military coronation can decide the relationship between the papacy and the empire. The German opposition also remains significant, since Hermann of Salm was elected as another opposing king in 1081 and remained a rival until 1088. Henry must therefore carry the memory of victory alongside the practical burden of unfinished resistance. The ceremony of 1084 has restored imperial dignity, but it has not restored universal agreement. A crown may be placed upon a head in a single morning, while legitimacy must be defended through years of correspondence, ritual, and force. In the quiet after rain, the road outside Rome appears washed, but never clean. You notice pale dust gathered again between the stones, forming delicate lines where wheels and sandals have passed. An olive press turns somewhere beyond the houses, producing a slow wooden rhythm beneath the dripping roofs. The smell of oil, wet wool, and old masonry rests in the cool air. At a church entrance, wax has hardened upon a metal stand, and the last flame leans towards a draught. A bronze door closes with a weight that seems to belong to the building itself, shutting away voices without extinguishing them. Small pools reflect broken pieces of sky, while the walls hold the warmth of the afternoon only briefly. The city's surfaces suggest endurance, yet each mark upon them has been made by movement, conflict, or departure. Nothing remains entirely still, even when the evening seems calm. Urban II is elected Pope in 1088, and under his leadership, the reform movement gains renewed strength. You encounter his influence first through letters, councils, and the steady reorganization of ideas that Henry's victories have failed to suppress. Urban continues the reforming work associated with Gregory, though the political landscape has altered since Canossa and Rome has become a place of competing memories. The movement now reaches beyond the immediate question of who may invest bishops, gathering arguments about clerical discipline, church property, and the freedom of ecclesiastical institutions. Urban later promotes armed pilgrimage to the Holy Land, extending the energy of reform into a wider religious and military vision. The road from Canossa to Rome has therefore opened into a much larger history. Henry's conflict with Gregory has helped create conditions in which papal authority can be imagined beyond a single kingdom, a single emperor, or a single contested appointment. A colder wind crosses the Italian hills, carrying the smell of wet grass and olive wood burning in village hearths. You walk beside a stone wall where moss shines beneath the rain, and small streams slip under roots before joining the lower fields. The road feels soft beneath your sandals, though Roman dust remains lodged in the leather seams. From a monastery, prayer emerges through a narrow window, quiet enough to mingle with the sound of water falling from the roof. The evening darkens slowly, giving the olive trees a silvery edge before their leaves become black shapes. A bronze church door closes somewhere behind you, and the sound travels across the valley with solemn patience. Clouds cover the higher ridges, leaving only a faint band of light above the horizon. The land seems to remember every traveller without retaining any single traveller's claim for long. The settlement at Canossa was therefore a temporary political success for Henry, not a final settlement of the investiture controversy. You can trace its usefulness through the years that followed, because absolution restored the king's place within the church and removed the easiest grounds for his immediate deposition. Henry regained space to negotiate, assemble supporters, and meet his rivals upon more equal political ground. Yet the German princes elected Rudolf of Rheinfelden in March 1077, and the civil war continued despite the penitential settlement. Rudolf's defeat at Hohenmölsen on 15 October 1080 strengthened Henry's position, but Rudolf died soon afterwards from wounds, and his death did not dissolve the deeper dispute. Gregory's second excommunication in 1080 led Henry towards Clement III, Rome, and the imperial coronation of 1084. Each success answered one danger while opening another. Night settles over the road with the smell of ash and winter rain. You hear a cart moving slowly somewhere beyond the trees, its wheel striking a buried stone at regular intervals. The sound of water runs beneath a narrow bridge, hidden beneath reeds and darkness. In a nearby courtyard, prayer is whispered beside a wall still cold from the day, and the voices rise without urgency. Snow darkening beneath feet belongs to Canossa, while Roman dust beneath marching sandals belongs to the later road. Yet both images now lie within the same memory. Olive smoke drifts across the fields, faintly visible whenever the wind turns it towards the moon. The church doors have closed for the evening, and their final resonance has faded into the ordinary noises of animals and rain. The world offers no simple silence, only layers of quiet placed upon older quiet. You return in thought to Canossa, where Henry waited through 3 days of prayer, cold, and negotiation before Gregory VII granted absolution. The penitential encounter restored Henry to communion within the church and removed the immediate justification for the German princes to depose him solely because he was excommunicated. It did not give Gregory permanent control over Henry's kingship, and it did not settle the authority to appoint, command, or judge. Rudolf's election in March 1077 proved how quickly political opposition could survive a religious reconciliation. Henry's victory at Hohenmölsen on 15 October 1080 gave him strength, while Gregory's renewed excommunication led him towards Clement III and the capture of Rome. In 1084, an imperial crown was placed upon Henry in Rome, but Gregory escaped with Norman help and died at Salerno on 25 May 1085. Ceremony had answered neither conscience nor politics. The last rain of the season rests upon the stones like a thin glaze. You stand beneath a shelter where the timber smells of dampness, and the air carries olive smoke from a hidden fire. A few grains of Roman dust remain upon the road, pressed into the shallow prints of sandals and hooves. Somewhere beyond the walls, a wooden gate gives its hollow sound, then falls quiet. The cold courtyard receives another whisper of prayer, its words indistinct, but its rhythm steady. Evening gathers around the bronze doors of the church, which have closed against the darkness and hold the warmth of candles within. Above the hills, the clouds begin to separate, revealing a narrow and colorless sky. The journey from Canossa to Rome has left no single road behind, only paths crossing through snow, rain, dust, exile, and renewed ambition. You see Henry's crown regained in Rome, yet the conflict has become larger than Henry and Gregory, larger even than the rival kings and rival popes who carried it. Urban II's election in 1088 strengthens the reform movement, and his later promotion of armed pilgrimage to the Holy Land shows how far papal authority may extend beyond the quarrel that began at Canossa. Hermann of Salm remains a rival until 1088, while Clement III continues as Henry's chosen papal counterpart. The empire has not been made peaceful by a coronation, and the church has not been made obedient by a royal army. Canossa offered Henry a breathing space, a temporary political success, and the restoration of communion. It offered Gregory an opportunity to define mercy as authority. Neither man received a final settlement. Beyond the castle, The Alps keep their silence, while the conflict renews itself along every road leading away from January 1077. The rebellion returned to Henry IV through the lives of his own sons, appearing first in Conrad and later in the younger Henry, as though the empire had learned to speak with a familiar voice. In 1087, Conrad was made co-king beside his father, receiving a title intended to promise continuity within the Salian house. Yet the arrangement brought no lasting harmony. During the 1090s, Conrad joined forces opposing Henry, challenging the authority he had once been expected to inherit. Around you, the old imperial language of obedience sounds increasingly fragile, because the son crowned to preserve his father's order now stands among those who resist it. Conrad's rebellion weakened his political position, and his career ended far from the German roads in Florence, where he died in 1101. The first son had been raised towards kingship, opposed his father, and vanished before the succession could become secure. You are standing beside a road descending through the Meuse Valley, where rain darkens the stones and gathers in shallow channels between the wheel ruts. The hills draw close around the route, their wooded slopes dissolving into a grey veil beneath the low sky. Water slips from the branches in patient intervals, striking leather cloaks, wooden carts, and the iron rims of travelling wagons. Somewhere beyond the mist, a bell marks the hour from a church whose walls remain hidden. Horses breathe heavily as they climb, their harness creaking with each measured movement. The scent of wet earth mingles with the sharper odour of river mud, while the road carries the subdued noise of men who have travelled too long to speak loudly. Rain on the roads of the Meuse Valley turns every mile westward into a slow passage through uncertainty. Henry's younger son, the future Henry V, had been born either in 1081 or 1086, and the exact year remains uncertain in the surviving record. His childhood unfolded beneath the shadow cast by Conrad's rebellion, while Henry IV continued to defend his authority against princes, bishops, and the papal party. In 1098, the younger Henry became co-king with his father, in a carefully arranged succession intended to prevent another collapse within the royal family. The ceremony carried an appearance of order, yet the memory of Conrad remained close. The new co-king inherited not only a crown, but also a difficult political legacy. By 1105, Henry V allied himself with opponents of Henry IV and with the papal party, turning the instruments of succession against the reigning king. Once again, a son stood beside forces seeking to judge, restrain, and finally remove his father. The rain has softened the edges of the world, leaving the riverbank and distant fields without a clear boundary. You hear water pushing slowly against reeds, followed by the muffled splash of hooves crossing a flooded hollow. A cloak brushes against your sleeve as a traveller passes, carrying the cool smell of wool that has dried and become wet again many times. The sky has no visible sun, though a pale brightness rests above the western hills. Small fires burn beneath an overhanging bank, their smoke pressed flat by the damp air. On the road, mud clings to boots and splashes against the lower boards of carts. The Meuse Valley offers no triumphal entrance, only dripping branches, dim crossings, and whether moving patiently over men, unsure where loyalty will lead them. The new alliance changed the balance around Henry IV, because Henry V could present himself as the defender of peace, while his father was portrayed as the source of disorder. The papal party had long maintained that a ruler who violated the order of the church could be corrected by earthly authorities, and now that argument found its most powerful instrument within the royal household. In 1105, Henry V gathered support from princes weary of Henry IV's prolonged conflicts, and from ecclesiastical opponents seeking to strengthen papal judgment. The father's earlier victory at Canossa now appeared in reverse, with the son preparing to make captivity and submission the price of political survival. Henry IV moved through a narrowing circle of uncertain allies, while Henry V approached with the calm determination of a man who believed kingship could be preserved by removing the king. You are near a fortified settlement where shutters cover the windows before night has fully arrived. Behind the closed timber, a small room holds the smell of damp stone, extinguished fire, and clothing that has not been changed during a hurried confinement. A guard moves along the passage outside, and the boards answer with a faint groan beneath his weight. Through a narrow opening, you can see rain descending across the courtyard, silver for a moment where it catches torchlight. The flame trembles whenever the door opens, sending a thin warmth across the floor before the cold returns. Beyond the walls, horses shift in their stalls, and metal touches metal in brief, restrained sounds. The shuttered room where a king is held seems smaller than the kingdom whose fate is being discussed beyond its door. At Berkelheim in December 1105, Henry IV was captured by his son, giving physical form to the political reversal that had gathered for years. The king who had once compelled his opponents to kneel now found himself confined under the authority of the heir he had elevated. Henry V demanded that Henry IV abandon the struggle, surrender the symbols of rule, and accept the settlement prepared by his enemies. Under pressure, Henry IV abdicated at Ingelheim on 31 December 1105, placing the act at the threshold of a new year and allowing his son to present the change as an accomplished necessity. The abdication did not arise from a free exchange between equal parties, because captivity stood behind every word. Even so, it provided Henry V with a public claim to lawful succession, while Henry IV's royal dignity was reduced to the silence of a prisoner. Berkelheim lies beneath a winter sky that seems close enough to touch the battlements. Meltwater runs from the roof tiles and falls in uneven drops beside the doorway. You stand in the courtyard where footprints overlap until no single path can be traced with confidence. The stones are pale with frost at their edges, though the center remains dark beneath boots and hooves. A horse exhales a cloud that drifts across the lantern light, briefly hiding the face of the man holding its bridle. Inside the walls, voices remain low, and a heavy door closes with a final wooden sound. The air carries the faint bitterness of cold ashes, wet leather, and straw. Each bell from a distant church arrives softened by the wind, as though the countryside were reluctant to carry news of what had happened there. Henry IV did not remain peacefully displaced after the abdication. He escaped captivity and attempted to recover his authority, transforming the settlement of 1105 into the beginning of another struggle. The escape revealed that Henry V's victory had been incomplete, because royal legitimacy could not be secured merely by locking a father behind guarded doors. Henry IV found support in parts of the Western Empire, especially around Liege, where local loyalties, political calculations, and resistance to the papal party gathered around his cause. The old king still possessed a name that could command allegiance, and some supporters continued to regard him as the rightful holder of an office that no earthly tribunal could lawfully remove. During the opening months of 1106, renewed military confrontation between father and son seemed likely. Armies moved, messengers traveled, and the western lands prepared for a conflict that might decide whether Henry IV could return to power. Church bells sound over Liege, while river mist rises at dawn from the broad course of the Meuse. You are standing near the water, where the damp air settles against your face and turns the stones beneath your feet dark and smooth. The first light reveals roofs, towers, and narrow streets in fragments, each shape emerging briefly before the vapor closes again. Bells pass above the town in layers, some clear and bright, others blurred by distance and moisture. A boat nudges against its mooring, its rope tightening with a soft creak. Along the bank, reeds bend beneath beads of water, and the smell of the river mingles with smoke from early hearths. Liege does not appear as a place of certainty, but as a western refuge assembled from mist, bells, and guarded hope. Henry IV's final political journey carried him towards that uncertain support around Liege, where his remaining loyalists could still imagine a restoration. He had survived the immediate consequences of abdication, but he could not erase the fact that his son now possessed the stronger institutional position. Henry V had the allegiance of many princes, the support of the papal party, and the advantage of claiming that obedience to him would restore peace. Henry IV had memory, personal loyalty, and the conviction that the crown rested upon a sacred order older than any gathering of princes. The distance between father and son was therefore more than a family quarrel, because both represented competing definitions of kingship. In the Western Empire, the old ruler's presence gave shape to resistance, while Henry V prepared to meet him before the opposition could become a second royal government. The morning mist thins above Liege, leaving beads of moisture on the wooden rails along the river. You pass beneath walls that hold the night's cold in their joints, and your hand feels the roughness of stones worn by generations of weather. A cart rolls slowly through a gate, its wheels carrying a skin of mud from the road beyond. From an open bakehouse comes the warm scent of grain, though the street itself remains grey and chilly. The bells continue at a slower interval, their vibrations lingering against the masonry after the sound has faded. Men gather beneath an awning, speaking in voices too quiet for their words to travel. Near the water, a pale strip of sky rests behind the rooftops, and river mist folds the city into a place between departure and return. The final confrontation between Henry IV and Henry V did not occur as the armies expected. Before the renewed military struggle could be fully joined, Henry IV died unexpectedly at Liege on 7 August 1106. The date entered the memory of the empire with severe simplicity, because the father's life ended before the son could defeat him in decisive battle. Henry IV had escaped captivity, gathered support, and attempted to recover his authority, yet the restoration remained unfinished when illness or sudden physical collapse overtook him. The king, who had endured decades of rebellion, excommunication, invasion, and political humiliation, reached the end of his life among Western supporters rather than within the imperial heartlands. On 7 August 1106, Henry IV died at Liege, and the conflict with Henry V passed from the field of battle into questions of burial, legitimacy, and memory. At Liege, the summer air has cooled beside the river, and the stones retain the chill of night beneath the warmth of the afternoon. You stand near a church wall where shadows gather under carved ledges and narrow windows. A thin breeze carries the scent of water, crushed grass, and smoke from cooking fires beyond the street. Somewhere within the town, a bell begins slowly, then is joined by another, until the sound settles over the roofs like a dark cloth. Men move with lowered heads, and horses wait quietly beneath a covered shelter. The river continues towards the west, indifferent to the death of a king whose disputes had crossed mountains and generations. Along the bank, the last threads of mist loosen in the light, leaving Liege exposed beneath a sky that offers no explanation. According to the traditional account of his final years, Henry IV died, still under excommunication. The unresolved ban shaped the treatment of his body, because his enemies could present the sanction as proof that his authority had remained spiritually defective until the end. His remains were initially denied ordinary burial, and the king's corpse became the object of further ecclesiastical and political complications. The body could not simply be placed in consecrated ground, while the question of absolution remained unsettled. Henry V had inherited a throne whose legitimacy had been strengthened by opposition to his father, Yet the dead ruler still required careful handling because his supporters remained active, and his memory could not safely be dismissed. The death at Liege, therefore, did not close the controversy. It carried the controversy into churches, councils, letters, and the long silence surrounding the place where a king ought to rest. You are inside a church where winter has entered through the stone, although candles burn near the altar. The floor beneath you is uneven, and cold rises through the soles of your shoes with slow, persistent pressure. An unquiet coffin rests in the dimness, watched by men who speak rarely and move with deliberate caution. Wax softens near the flames, releasing a faint sweetness that mixes with dust, old wood, and damp cloth. Outside, footsteps pass over the paving stones, then disappear beneath the echo of a bell. No choir fills the building, and no settled ceremony gathers around the body. Cold stone and an unquiet coffin hold the silence of unresolved judgment, while candlelight trembles across metal fittings and leaves the corners of the church in darkness. Henry's remains were eventually taken to the imperial burial church at Speyer after further ecclesiastical and political complications. The journey placed the body within the tradition of the Salian rulers, yet it did not immediately remove the doubts that had followed Henry IV through life and death. Speyer had long been associated with imperial memory, dynastic continuity, and the solemn architecture of power, but the transfer could not make the unresolved band disappear. The dead king arrived as both ruler and accused man, defended by loyalists and condemned by enemies. His burial became part of the larger contest over whether papal authority could reach into the disposition of royal persons and whether earthly institutions could judge a monarch. In Speyer, Henry IV was placed among predecessors whose tombs spoke of continuity, while the circumstances of his death spoke instead of rupture. The road towards Speyer passes through cold fields where winter light rests weakly on the hedges. You hear the slow wheels of a funeral procession, each turn producing a muted groan from the axle. Frost lies in the hollows, and the grasses carry tiny points of brightness whenever the cloud opens above them. A raven crosses the pale sky and disappears behind a line of bare trees. Beneath the coverings, cloth shifts gently with the cart's motion, while attendants keep their hands close to their bodies against the air. The landscape gives little sign of the argument traveling through it. Roads, bridges, and river crossings receive the procession without protest, carrying Henry's remains towards Speyer beneath a sky the color of old silver. At Speyer, the imperial burial church gathered the dead ruler into a place designed to make dynastic history appear continuous. Yet Henry IV's career had weakened the idea that a king was answerable only to God and not to earthly judgment. His enemies insisted that excommunication, deposition, and resistance could be directed against a ruler who violated the order of the church. His supporters replied that God-given kingship could not be cancelled by princes or bishops acting under political pressure. Between those positions stood Henry himself, whose authority had been challenged by nobles, popes, bishops, and finally by his own sons. The conflict did not produce an immediate theory accepted by everyone, but it changed the language available to future generations. A king could still claim sacred office, yet the claim no longer placed him entirely beyond judgment. The interior of Speyer is broad, shadowed, and still beneath the weight of its vaults. You walk along the edge of the burial church where the air smells of stone, dust, and old wax. Light enters through high openings in muted bands, touching a pillar here and the rim of a tomb there. Candle flames hiss faintly whenever a wick bends close to the melted pool around it. Beneath your feet, the floor holds the chill of the earth below, and every step returns in a softened echo. Incense has faded into the masonry, leaving only a trace of sweetness near the altar. The church seems to preserve time by slowing every sound, allowing the dead to remain present without speaking. The conflicts of Henry IV's reign strengthened the role of German princes in choosing and conditioning royal authority. Princes had not become absolute masters of the monarchy, nor had the king ceased to command armies, offices, and loyalty. Nevertheless, their collective capacity to withhold support, organize opposition, and shape succession had become more visible and consequential. The elevation of Henry V showed that royal continuity could be negotiated through princely action, even when the reigning monarch resisted the arrangement. The papacy's claim to judge secular rulers also became a durable feature of Western political thought. Henry IV's experience supplied an enduring example of the question whether a ruler who held office by sacred inheritance could be corrected by spiritual authorities and opposed by temporal subjects. In the streets beyond the church, evening settles over Speyer, and the last light turns the damp paving stones a subdued blue. You hear a distant cart crossing the square, followed by the rustle of cloaks as people pass beneath the arcade. Rain has begun again, though it falls lightly enough to remain almost invisible in the dark. Water gathers along the walls and reflects the small lamps fixed above the doors. From the river comes a slow breath of mist, carrying the smell of wet reeds and cold timber. The bells have fallen silent for the moment, leaving candlelight and rain as the nearest sounds. A draught moves through the church, touching the flames and causing shadows to lean across the ancient stone. The investiture controversy continued after Henry IV's death. Henry V, who had used the papal party to overthrow his father, eventually discovered that cooperation with the papacy did not settle the limits of royal authority. The dispute over bishops, offices, symbols, and the relationship between spiritual and secular power remained active for years. It was settled only in 1122 under Henry V and Pope Calixtus II, when the Concordat of Worms created a compromise that neither side could describe as complete victory. The settlement belonged to a later generation, yet its foundations had been laid through the struggles of Henry IV. The king who had lost his crown to his son did not live to see the agreement that defined the institutional shape of the controversy he had endured. Dawn comes slowly over the Rhine, and a faint veil of river mist lies between the embankment and the distant fields. You are near the water where the surface carries broken reflections of towers, branches, and the paling sky. The air is cold enough to sharpen each breath, while the current moves without hurry beneath the low bridge. A fisherman draws in a wet rope, and droplets fall from it with a regular ticking sound. Behind you, the church remains dark, except for a few candles burning near the burial places. The mist drifts towards the reeds, thinning where the first light touches it. Along the river, the world seems emptied of argument, though the stones and graves retain every dispute that passed beside them. Henry IV's career remained contested because the meaning of his rule depended upon the position from which it was remembered. Supporters portrayed him as a defender of God-given kingship, protecting the ancient dignity of the crown against princes seeking advantage and popes claiming jurisdiction over secular rulers. Enemies portrayed him as a tyrant whose coercion, political maneuvering, and resistance to ecclesiastical correction had brought disorder upon the empire. Both portraits survived because Henry's actions could be read through competing ideas of authority. His submission at Canossa could appear as prudent humility or humiliating weakness, while his resistance after 1105 could appear as courage or refusal to accept lawful judgment. Even his burial carried the argument forward, because the body of the king remained a political object after his voice had fallen silent. You stand beneath the western sky as evening gathers along the roads leading away from Liege. The Meuse Valley is hidden beneath another layer of rain, and the distant hills appear as dark shapes without detail. Water taps against leaves, roof tiles, and the wooden sides of an abandoned cart. A shutter closes somewhere inside a nearby house, followed by the soft scrape of a bolt entering its socket. The road shines faintly, reflecting a thin line of grey light between the clouds. No procession now moves through the mud, and no messenger hurries towards the next fortress. Only the river keeps its direction, bearing cold air and scattered sounds towards the west. The rain settles over the memory of Henry's last journey. The man who had knelt to save kingship at Canossa never lived to see the argument settled. In 1077, Henry IV accepted humiliation to regain communion, preserve his political future, and continue the struggle over royal power. In 1105, his son forced him into captivity and abdication, reversing the political drama through which Henry had once recovered his throne. Henry IV escaped, found support around Liege, and seemed prepared to fight again. But death arrived on 7 August 1106, before the final war with Henry V could be fought. His body travelled towards Speyer, while the empire moved towards a future in which kingship remained sacred, but no longer entirely insulated from earthly judgment. The silence after his death was not peace, because the controversy endured until 1122. It was only the quiet interval in which later rulers learned to inherit an unsettled world. Night rests over Speyer, and the last candles burn low within the imperial burial church. You are beside the stone where Henry's remains were finally placed after the long complications of ban, custody, and ceremony. The nearest flame gives a faint hiss, then steadies, casting a narrow line of gold across the floor. Beyond the walls, rain moves over the roofs, while the river carries a darker current through the sleeping town. The coffin is now settled stone beneath a remembered king, though memory itself remains divided. In the darkness, the names Henry IV, Conrad, Henry V, Liege, and Speyer seem to rest together without agreement. The bells over Liege are far away now, and the quiet church is all that remains between the tomb and the night.